Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I hope you're settling in for the evening, getting comfortable wherever you are, if that be in your room, in a library while you study, or even at your night shift at work. Tonight I've got something a little different for you. Instead of diving into wild drama and chaos, we're going slow and reflective with some life lesson stories I've found from Reddit that'll hopefully give you something meaningful to think about as you drift off. These are the kinds of stories that stick with you, the ones where people share those quiet moments that changed everything, or the experiences that seemed small at the time but ended up shaping who they became. Before we start, I just wanted to say that we are about to close in on 9,000 subscribers on the channel, which quite frankly was something far beyond what I thought was possible on this channel. I remember starting this channel out, hoping to get to 100 by the end of the year. This was meant to be a small little project that I did for fun while I worked as a narrator. Little did I know this would grow into something much larger. If you've stuck here since the beginning, I just want to give a big thank you for all that you have done. You seriously have contributed to something big. Anyway, enough of my own story. Let's get into these life lessons. Take a deep breath, grab whatever, maybe dim the lights a bit, and let's dive into some stories that might just resonate with something in your own life. These come from all corners of Reddit, people opening up about the experiences that taught them the most important lessons they've ever learned. Our first story comes from someone reflecting on a relationship that completely broke them, but ultimately taught them something invaluable about their own worth. The relationship that broke me, but taught me boundaries. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and I need to get it out somewhere. This happened about 2 years ago, but I'm still processing everything I learned from it. I was with someone for 3.5 years. Let's call him Derek. When we started dating, I thought I'd found my person. He was charming, funny, seemed to care about my dreams and goals. But looking back, I can see how slowly things shifted. It wasn't dramatic at first, just little things that made me question myself. Derek would cancel plans last minute, always with a good excuse. Work emergency, family drama, car trouble. I'd be disappointed, but I'd tell myself these things happen. Then he started showing up late to things that mattered to me. My birthday dinner, my work promotion celebration, even my grandmother's funeral. Each time he'd apologise and promise to do better, and I'd forgive him because that's what you do when you love someone, right? The worst part was how he made me feel like I was asking for too much. When I'd bring up feeling neglected, he'd say I was being needy. When I'd ask him to communicate better, he'd accuse me of being controlling. Slowly, I started second-guessing every feeling I had. Maybe I was being too sensitive. Maybe I expected too much from relationships. I stopped hanging out with friends because Derek would get moody when I made plans without him. I turned down a job opportunity in another city because he said long distance never works. I gave up my Saturday morning yoga classes because he wanted to sleep in together. One by one, I let pieces of myself disappear to keep him happy. The breaking point came when I found out he'd been seeing someone else for 4 months. Not just texting or flirting, but actually dating her. Taking her to nice restaurants while he told me we couldn't afford to go out. Buying her flowers while he forgot my birthday. When I confronted him, he had the nerve to say it was my fault for being distant and unavailable. I was devastated. Not just because of the cheating, but because I realised how much of myself I'd lost trying to be enough for someone who never valued me anyway. I spent weeks crying, replaying every moment, wondering what I could have done differently. But something shifted during those dark weeks. I started remembering who I used to be before Derek. I remembered loving my independence, having opinions about things, making plans that excited me. I remembered friends I'd lost touch with, hobbies I'd abandoned, dreams I'd put on hold. The first boundary I set was with Derek himself. When he tried to come back, claiming he'd made a mistake and wanted to work things out, I said no. It was the hardest word I'd ever said, but also the most important. He tried everything, showing up at my apartment, sending gifts, calling my friends to convince me he'd changed, but I held firm. Then I started setting boundaries everywhere. I told my boss I wouldn't work weekends unless it was truly urgent. I told my family I couldn't be the one who always planned holiday gatherings. I told friends I needed relationships that felt balanced, where I wasn't always the one reaching out first. Some people didn't like the new boundaries. A few friendships faded when I stopped being available to solve everyone else's problems. My boss was annoyed when I started leaving at 5 instead of staying late every night. But something amazing happened too. The people who really mattered respected my limits. New opportunities opened up when I stopped saying yes to everything out of fear. I'm in a new relationship now, and it's completely different. When I told my current partner about my boundaries from the beginning, he didn't see them as walls to climb over. He saw them as information about how to love me better. When I say I need time with friends, he encourages it. When I say I'm not comfortable with something, we talk about it instead of him dismissing my feelings. I know this sounds cheesy, but losing that relationship saved me. It taught me that I'd rather be alone than with someone who makes me feel small. It showed me that love isn't supposed to require you to disappear. The right person will celebrate who you are, not try to change you into someone more convenient. I still have bad days where I doubt myself or wonder if I'm being too rigid. But then I remember how it felt to have no voice in my own life. And I know these boundaries aren't walls. They're the foundation of a life where I actually respect myself. That story hits deep because so many of us have been there, slowly giving up pieces of ourselves for someone who doesn't even notice or appreciate the sacrifice. The hardest lesson is often that love shouldn't require you to become smaller. Sometimes the relationship that breaks you is actually the one that saves you from a lifetime of settling. It takes incredible strength to rebuild yourself after that kind of betrayal, but when you do, you become unshakable. Here's our next story about a friendship that faded and the wisdom that came with letting go. The friend who drifted away. This is something I've been thinking about a lot as I get older. I'm 28 now, and I just realised I haven't talked to my childhood best friend in over a year. Her name was Megan, and we were inseparable from ages 6 to 18. We lived 3 houses apart, spent every summer together, had sleepovers every weekend. We were the kind of friends who had inside jokes that made no sense to anyone else, who could communicate with just a look across a crowded room. We planned our whole lives together, talking about being each other's maids of honour, raising our kids together, growing old in rocking chairs on adjacent porches. When we graduated high school, we both cried talking about how we'd never let distance change our friendship. She went to college 2 states away. I stayed local for community college first. We promised to call every day, text constantly, visit each other as much as possible. For the first year, we kept that promise. We'd have 3-hour phone calls about everything and nothing. She'd tell me about her roommate drama and new friends. I'd update her on hometown gossip and my part-time job. We visited each other twice that first year, and it felt like no time had passed at all. But slowly, things started changing. Our calls got shorter and less frequent. She'd tell me about people I'd never met, reference inside jokes I wasn't part of. I'd share things about my life, but they felt smaller compared to her college adventures. She was rushing sororities, studying abroad, dating guys with names like Bradford and Tanner. I was taking prerequisite classes and working at a coffee shop. By sophomore year, our conversations started feeling forced. We'd run out of things to say after 20 minutes. She'd mention parties and events casually, not realizing how left out it made me feel. I'd tell her about my community college friends, but I could hear in her voice that she was just being polite. The shift became obvious during her winter break junior year. She was home for 3 weeks, and we hung out twice. Both times felt awkward, like we were trying to recreate something that wasn't there anymore. She kept checking her phone, texting her college friends. I felt like I was boring her with stories about people she didn't know anymore. After that visit, our communication became sporadic. A text here and there, happy birthday messages, the occasional social media interaction. We both stopped trying as hard, and neither of us acknowledged what was happening. The last real conversation we had was 2 years ago, when she called to tell me she was getting engaged to a guy I'd never met. I was happy for her, but it hit me that I knew almost nothing about this strangers who shared a childhood. The person she was going to marry. We'd become a long time. I felt guilty about letting our friendship fade. I wondered if I should have tried harder, visited more, been more interested in her new life. I felt like I'd failed at something important, like I was a bad friend for not fighting harder to maintain our connection. But I've been thinking about it differently lately. Maybe not every friendship is supposed to last forever. Maybe some people come into your life for a specific season, and that's okay. Megan and I had an incredible friendship during the years we both needed it most. She taught me how to be loyal, how to laugh until my stomach hurt, how to keep secrets and share dreams. We were perfect friends for who we were then, but we grew into different people with different lives. Trying to force that childhood connection to fit our adult selves might. I saw on social media that she had her baby last month. I sent her a congratulatory message, and she responded with genuine warmth. We didn't try to catch up or make plans, but there was love in that brief exchange. Love for who we used to be to each other, and acceptance of who we are now. I think that's what I've learned about friendship as an adult. Some friends are meant to walk the whole journey with you. Others are meant to be there for specific chapters, teaching you what you need to learn during that time in your life. Both types of friendship are valuable and meaningful. I'm grateful for the 12 years Megan and I shared. She helped shape who I am in ways that will always be part of me. And I'm also grateful that we both had the wisdom to let our friendship evolve naturally instead of forcing it into something it wasn't meant to become. Sometimes love means holding on tightly. Sometimes it means letting go gracefully. There's something so bittersweet about friendships that naturally fade. We're taught that good friends last forever. But maybe the real gift is recognizing when someone was perfect for a season of your life, even if they're not meant for every season. It doesn't diminish what you shared. Some chapters are beautiful precisely because they end at the right time. That takes maturity to accept. Our next story comes from someone who learned that working hard doesn't always get you noticed, but it always builds character. The boss who never noticed my work. I need to share this because it took me way too long to learn this lesson. And maybe it'll help someone else figure it out sooner than I did. I worked at a mid-sized marketing firm for 2.5 years. When I started, I was so eager to prove myself. I'd always been the type of person who believed that hard work automatically led to recognition and advancement. Work harder than everyone else, go above and beyond, and eventually people will notice and reward being taught growing up. My boss, let's call him Richard, managed you for it. That's what I'd a team of 8 people. He was one of those guys who talked a big game about teamwork and company culture. But when it came down to it, he played obvious favourites. There were 2 people on our team who could do no wrong in his eyes, even when their work was mediocre at best. I threw myself into every project. When we had a big client presentation, I'd stay late perfecting the slides while my co-workers left at 5. When someone needed help with their workload, I'd volunteer, even if it meant working weekends. I created detailed reports that weren't required, came up with innovative solutions to ongoing problems, and consistently exceeded my targets. For months, I watched Richard praise other team members for work that was honestly just okay, while completely overlooking my contributions. In meetings, he'd acknowledge everyone else's input, but somehow skip over mine. When clients complimented our work directly to him, he'd thank the team generally, but never mention specific people, even when I'd done most of the heavy lifting. The breaking point came during our quarterly reviews. I'd prepared extensively, documenting all my achievements, the extra projects I'd taken on, the positive feedback from clients. I was sure this would be when Richard finally acknowledged how much I'd been contributing. Instead, he gave me a standard review with generic feedback about continuing to grow and develop. No mention of the campaign I'd single-handedly saved when a co-worker dropped the ball. No recognition of the weekend I'd spent fixing a major client issue. No acknowledgement of the process improvements I'd implemented that were saving the company time and money. Meanwhile, I heard through the office grapevine that two of my co-workers, the ones who barely met deadlines and left early most days, had gotten glowing reviews and were being considered for promotions. I was crushed. I went home that night and seriously considered quitting. I felt invisible, unappreciated, like all my effort had been completely wasted. I started questioning whether I was actually good at my job or if I was just deluding myself about the quality of my work. I spent that weekend in a dark place, wondering what the point was of trying so hard if nobody cared. But something my dad said on a phone call stuck with me. He told me that you can't control whether other people notice your work, but you can control whether you respect yourself for the effort you put in. That Monday I made a decision. I was going to keep doing excellent work, not because I expected Richard to finally notice, but because that's who I wanted to be as a professional. I was going to take pride in my own standards, regardless of whether anyone else appreciated them. And something weird happened. Once I stopped working for Richard's approval and started working for my own satisfaction, I actually enjoyed my job more. I wasn't constantly frustrated by his lack of recognition because I wasn't depending on him for validation. I knew when I'd done something well, and that was enough. About 6 months later, a client specifically requested to work with me on a major project. They told Richard they'd been impressed with my work on previous campaigns and wanted me to lead their account. Suddenly, Richard was very interested in keeping me happy. He offered me a raise and more responsibilities, but by then I'd already started interviewing elsewhere. I ended up taking a position at a smaller company where my boss actually pays attention to the quality of work people do. I've been there for a year now, and the difference is incredible. My contributions are noticed, my ideas are valued, and I'm already being considered for advancement. Here's what I learned from those 2.5 years with Richard. Your worth as a professional isn't determined by whether one person recognizes it. Some bosses are just bad at their jobs, and that has nothing to do with your value as an employee. The work ethic and standards you develop matter more than any single person's opinion of them. I'm actually grateful for that experience now. It taught me to fin. It showed me what kind of work environment I'd internal motivation and satisfaction in doing things well. Deserve and won't settle for less. And it proved that when you consistently do excellent work, the right people will eventually notice, even if it takes longer than you'd like. Richard is still at that company, by the way. From what I hear, he cycled through 3 more employees in my old position. Turns out when you don't recognise or develop good people, they leave, and eventually that catches up with you. That experience shows how toxic work environments can make you question your own value, when really they just reveal bad leadership. Some people advance through politics instead of performance, and that's their problem, not yours. The fact that he's burned through 3 replacements says everything you need to know about Richard's management style. Our next story is about finding community in the most unexpected moment. The neighbour who shared soup during a storm. I've been thinking about this memory a lot lately, especially with everything feeling so disconnected these days. This happened about 5 years ago during one of the worst winter storms our area had seen in decades. I'd just moved into my first apartment by myself. It was this old building with thin walls and drafty windows, but it was mine, and I was proud of that independence. I didn't really know any of my neighbours yet. I'd see them in the hallway sometimes, exchange polite nods, but we all kept to ourselves like people do in apartment buildings. The storm hit on a Tuesday night. I'd been tracking the weather all week, stocking up on candles and non-perishable food like everyone else. By evening, the wind was howling so loud it sounded like freight trains passing right outside my window. The snow was coming down sideways and I could hear tree branches snapping under the weight. Around 9 o'clock the power went out. Not just in my building, but everywhere. I looked out my window and the whole neighbourhood was dark except for the occasional flicker of flashlights or phone screens. My apartment got cold fast and I realised my preparations hadn't been as thorough as I'd thought. I had bought plenty of crackers and canned food, but nothing that would actually warm me up. My phone was at about 30% battery, and I was trying to conserve it. I wrapped myself in every blanket I owned and settled in for what I figured would be a long, miserable night. Then around 10:30, I heard a soft knock at my door. I was hesitant to answer because honestly, who knocks on strangers' doors during a blackout? But the knocking was gentle, not threatening. So I cracked the door open while keeping the chain latched. Standing in the hallway was my neighbour from across the hall, holding a thermos and a flashlight. I had seen her a few times before, an older woman in her 60s with grey hair and kind eyes, but we had never actually introduced ourselves properly. I thought her name was Margaret. "I'm so sorry to bother you," she said, "but I made a big pot of soup before the power went out. It's getting pretty cold in here." I was and it's still warm. "I thought you might like some since I barely knew." Checking on me during a storm, offering touched, I almost started crying. Here was this woman to share her food. I unlatched the chain and opened the door properly. "That's incredibly kind of you," I said. "I'm actually pretty unprepared for this." She smiled and handed me the thermos. "We all learn these things as we go. I've lived through enough storms to know what helps." The soup was this amazing homemade chicken and vegetable blend, still steaming hot. I invited her in, and we ended up sitting in my living room by candlelight, sharing the soup and talking for over an hour. She told me about the building's history, about other grandchildren who lived across the country's storms she'd weathered, about her. I learned that Margaret had been a teacher for 37 years, that she loved gardening but missed having a yard, and that she worried about the young people in the building, not knowing their neighbours. She had a gentle way of listening that made me want to share more, even though we had just met. Eventually, she gathered her thermos and flashlight and said, "If you need anything, you know where I am." When the soup was gone, Margaret told me, "If you need anything else tonight, don't hesitate to knock. And tomorrow, once this passes, maybe we can check on some of the other neighbours together." After she left, I realised I wasn't cold anymore, and not just because of the soup. There was something about that unexpected kindness that warmed me from the inside out. I had been so focused on being independent and self-sufficient that I had forgotten how good it felt to be cared for by someone, even a stranger. The power came back on the next afternoon, but Margaret and I kept our promise to check on other neighbours. We discovered that Mrs. Chen on the 3rd floor had been without heat all night, and that the college student in 2B had run out of food entirely. We organised an impromptu building dinner, and suddenly this place that had felt like a collection of strangers started to feel like a community. Margaret and I became real friends after that storm. She taught me how to make her soup recipe, and I helped her set up a small herb garden on the fire escape. When she had surgery last year, I was the one driving her to appointments and picking up groceries. When I was going through a rough breakup, she was the one listening over tea and homemade cookies. What started as a simple act of kindness during a blackout turned into one of the most meaningful friendships I've ever had. It taught me that community isn't something that just happens. It's something you create by reaching out, even in small ways. I think about that knock on my door a lot now. How easy it would have been for Margaret to just eat her soup alone and assume everyone else was fine. How different my life might have been if she hadn't taken that small step to check on a neighbour she barely knew. Sometimes the most important connections happen when everything else falls apart, because crisis has a way of revealing the best in people. Margaret could have just stayed warm in her own apartment, but instead she thought about others first. Those moments of unexpected kindness during difficult times often become the foundation for lifelong connections. That story gives me chills because it shows how community is built, not through grand gestures, but through showing up with soup when the lights go out. Here's another story, this one about discovering that the hardest experiences can sometimes forge the strongest character. This was my sophomore year of high school, and I had made the varsity soccer team mostly because they needed bodies. I was decent, but not great, and definitely not used to the intensity of varsity-level training. Coach Martinez had a reputation for being tough, but I thought I was ready for anything. I was wrong. At the first practice, she had us running suicides until 3 girls threw up. Then we did passing drills, where if you missed your target, the whole team had to start over. I had never experienced anything like it. In JV, if you messed up, you just tried again. Here, your mistakes affected everyone, and you felt that weight immediately. Coach Martinez had this way of looking at you that made you feel like she could see every weakness, every moment you wanted to quit. She would call you out in front of everyone. You think jogging will win games? You're jogging, not running. Or, Sarah, that pass was lazy. Lazy players sit on the bench. After 2 weeks, I was dreading practice every day. I would sit in my last class with my stomach in knots, trying to convince myself I was sick so I could skip. Some days I actually went to the nurse's office with mysterious headaches or stomach aches, but something kept bringing me back. Maybe it was fear of being seen as a quitter. Maybe it was stubbornness. The worst practice happened about a month in, when coach arranged a scrimmage against the boys' JV team as a character-building exercise. The boys were bigger, faster, and clearly not taking it easy on us. They played physical, trash-talking, basically trying to intimidate us off the ball. I was getting frustrated because I kept losing possession, and Coach Martinez kept yelling at me to be stronger, to fight for the ball. You're playing like you're afraid of contact, Sarah. Soccer isn't a gentle sport. Finally, I snapped. I yelled back at her. Maybe if you actually taught us something instead of just screaming at us, we'd be better. The field went dead silent. Everyone stopped playing and stared. Coach Martinez blew her whistle and walked over to me slowly. I thought I was about to get kicked off the team, and honestly, part of me was relieved. But instead of yelling, she spoke quietly, so only I could hear. Meet me after practice. We need to talk. Those 2 hours of practice felt like forever. I was convinced she was going to humiliate me in front of everyone or make me run until I collapsed. When everyone else left, I prepared for the worst. Sit down, she said, pointing to the bleachers. Tell me what you think my job is. I was confused. To coach soccer? Be more specific, I thought about it. The teacher shook her head. My plays and skills and how to win games? You want to quit during a difficult job, is to prepare you for things that are harder than soccer. Every time drill and you don't, you're building back up. Every time you push through when. Every time you get knocked down and get something inside yourself that you'll need later, your body wants to stop. You're becoming someone who can handle whatever life throws at you, she continued. You think I'm being mean, but I'm showing you that you're stronger than you realize. That moment when you yelled at me? That was the first time I saw you really fight. I'd rather have a player who pushes back than one who just accepts whatever comes. I started crying, which was embarrassing, but she didn't seem to mind. I don't know if I'm strong enough for this, I said. You are, she said simply. You've been coming to practice for 5, that's courage. Now weeks even though you hate it. That's not weakness, I need you to trust that I know what I'm doing. Something shifted after that conversation. I started seeing the brutal practices differently. When she made us run extra laps because someone missed a shot, I focused on the fact that I was getting stronger. When she criticised my form, I tried to hear the instruction instead of the criticism. When scrimmages got physical, I leaned into the contact instead of shying away. By the end of the season, I was starting midfielder, not because I was the most talented, but because I was the player who had chased, become someone who didn't give up when things got difficult, were losing badly, who would encourage teammates when down every ball, who would keep running even when they wanted to quit. That mental toughness Coach Martinez forced me to develop ended up serving me far beyond soccer. When I struggled through calculus senior year, I remembered how to push through frustration instead of giving up. When I was overwhelmed freshman year of college, I reminded myself that I could handle more stress than I believed. And when I was job hunting after graduation, facing rejection after rejection, I had the resilience to keep applying. Almost 8 years later, I ran into Coach Martinez at a coffee shop. I thanked her for being so hard on us, and she smiled. You girls taught me as much as I taught you. Watching you discover your own strength was the best part of coaching. She retired from coaching 2 years ago, but she still gets letters from former players thanking her for pushing them beyond what they thought they could handle. She built something in all of us that only reveals itself when life gets hard. Looking back now, I'm grateful for every brutal practice, every moment I wanted to quit but didn't. Coach Martinez was right. She wasn't just preparing us for games, she was preparing us for life. Either most unfair when you're learning them, sometimes the people, than soccer. The hardest lessons often feel who push you the hardest are the ones who believe in you the most. Coach Martinez saw potential that her players couldn't see in themselves, and she was willing to be the bad guy to help them find it. That kind of tough love is rare. Our next story shows how losing everything can sometimes lead you exactly strength. You don't know? You have only emerges when someone refuses to let you quit, because it requires someone to prioritize your growth over your comfort. The accept I'm not there anymore. I'm actually year anniversary at Morrison & Associates, writing this on what would have been my 3 where you needed to go. The time I lost my job. I'm sitting in my own office now, running a business I never imagined I'd have the courage to start. Funny enough, losing the job I thought I wanted was what led me to the life I actually needed. 3 years and 2 months ago, I was hired as a junior marketing coordinator at Morrison & Associates, a mid-sized advertising firm downtown. I was thrilled. Decent salary, good benefits, a sleek modern office, and creative work that felt important. It was my first real job, and for the first year and a half, everything seemed fine. I was learning the ropes, building relationships with clients, and getting positive feedback on my campaigns. My boss, Janet, seemed pleased with my progress, and I felt like I was on track toward the senior coordinator position that would eventually open up. But everything shifted when the company hired a new creative director, Paul. He came from a larger Chicago firm and immediately started restructuring how we operated. He brought in his own people, changed the approval chains, and rewrote campaigns to fit what he called industry best practices. The freedom we'd had before disappeared, replaced with rigid processes. I tried to adapt to Paul's systems, but it became clear early on that he had his favourites. The people he brought with him from Chicago got the interesting projects, while those of us who'd been there longer were pushed onto routine work. Whenever I contributed ideas in meetings, Paul would brush them aside or hand them to someone else to develop. It was discouraging to see my input ignored, while others, usually from his inner circle, got credit for the same concepts. The writing was on whispers about budget cuts and restructuring. Certain projects were being moved to Paul's inner circle, and I was increasingly left out of important client meetings. Janet seemed apologetic, but powerless to change the direction things were heading. On a Tuesday morning, Ryan looked uncomfortable, kept fidgeting with papers on her desk. "I'm so marched," Janet called me into her office. "She's sorry, but we're going to have to let you go. Paul is restructuring the department, and your position is being eliminated." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. I kept asking what I'd done wrong, if there was anything I could have done differently. Janet's direction, but it didn't make the assured me it wasn't about my performance, just about the company's new rejection sting any less. I cleaned out my desk and co-workers who couldn't quite meet my eyes. The whole experience was humiliating and confusing. I'd thought a days carrying a cardboard box of personal items past I was building something stable, and suddenly I was unemployed with no warning and no plan. The first few weeks were dark. I spent most days in my pajamas scrolling through job listings that all seemed to require experience I didn't have, or skills I hadn't developed. I sent out dozens of applications and got very few responses. When I did came across 2 potential employers. My savings were interviews. I felt desperate and defeated, which probably running low, and I was starting to a part-time job at a coffee shop, just panic about rent and bills. I took like I was moving backward professionally, all to have some income coming in, but I felt friends were advancing in their careers while I was steaming milk and taking orders from college students. But something interesting started happening during those long shifts at the coffee shop. I began talking to the customers, really Maria, who came in every morning before opening, listening to their stories. There was this woman, her small bakery down the street. She was always stressed about marketing her business, trying to figure out how to reach more customers without spending money she didn't have. I found myself giving her advice about social media and local advertising. Nothing fancy, just the basic strategies I'd learned at Morrison & Associates. She started implementing my suggestions, and within a few weeks, she was seeing real results. More customers, busier weekends, positive reviews online. Maria insisted on paying me for my help, though at first I just enjoyed watching her business grow. Word spread to other small business owners in the area, and soon I had 3 or 4 people asking me for marketing advice. I started informally, meeting people for coffee and brainstorming ideas, but then I realized I was actually good at this. Better than I'd been at Morrison, because now I was working with people who genuinely needed help and appreciated creative solutions. These small business owners didn't have big advertising budgets, so I had to be resourceful and innovative in ways I'd never had to be before. 6 months after losing my job, I officially launched my own marketing consultancy, specializing in small businesses and local entrepreneurs. I was terrified and had no idea how to run a business, but I knew I could help my clients in ways the big firms couldn't or wouldn't. It's been almost 2 years now, and my business has grown beyond anything I imagined. I have 12 regular clients. I'm making more money than I ever did at Morrison & Associates, and I wake up every morning excited about the work I'm doing. I'm helping people build their dreams instead of selling products they don't even believe in. The crazy part is that I never would have had the courage to start my own business if I hadn't been forced out of my comfortable job. I would have stayed at Morrison for years, probably getting increasingly frustrated, but too scared to make a change. Losing that job was devastating at the time, but it pushed me towards something I didn't even know I wanted. I heard through mutual friends that Paul's restructuring at Morrison didn't go well. They lost several major clients and had to lay off more people. Meanwhile, I'm building a career I love, working with passionate entrepreneurs who trust me to help them grow. Sometimes, the worst thing that happens to you is actually the best thing that could have happened. I just couldn't see it at the time. That reality hits hard when you realize your dreams aren't derailing because of external forces, but because you're building someone else's success on your own sacrifice. The strongest people I know didn't start that way. They were forged in situations where they had to choose between shrinking or setting boundaries. That job loss was probably the universe saving you from years of settling for less than you deserved. Let's move to a story about how failure can sometimes be the best teacher you never wanted. The teacher who called me out. I've been thinking about Mrs. Henderson a lot lately, especially now that I'm in my final year of college and actually succeeding at things I once thought were impossible. This was 8th grade, and I was coasting through school like I had been for years. I was smart enough to get by without really trying, pulling B's and C's with minimal effort. I'd figured out how to do just enough to avoid getting in trouble at home, while still having plenty of time for video games and hanging out with friends. Mrs. Henderson taught honours English, and I wasn't even supposed to be in her class. There had been some scheduling mix-up, and instead of regular English, I got placed in the accelerated section. I figured I'd just ride it out until they fixed the mistake or until the semester ended. The first few weeks, I did what I always did. Skimmed the reading assignments, wrote papers the night before they were due, participated just enough to show I wasn't completely checked out. The work was definitely harder than what I was used to, but I was still managing to scrape by with C's. Then came the day that changed everything. We were discussing a novel we were supposed to have read, and Mrs. Henderson was asking these really detailed questions about character development and themes. I could tell she was getting frustrated because most of us were giving surface-level answers or just sitting there silently. She stopped mid-sentence and looked directly at me. "Laura," she said, "what did you think of the way the author handled the protagonist's relationship with his father?" I panicked. I'd only read about half the book and definitely hadn't thought deeply about any relationships. I gave some generic answer about how it seemed realistic and showed growth over time. Mrs. Henderson nodded slowly, but I could see something shift in her expression. That's an interesting observation, she said. Can you give me a specific example from the text that supports that? I fumbled around, trying to remember any scene that might work, but it was obvious I was just guessing. The classroom got quiet, and I could feel everyone watching me struggle. I see, Mrs. Henderson said. Laura, can you stay after class, please? Those few minutes until the bell rang felt like hours. I was sure I was in trouble for not doing the reading, but I figured I'd just apologize and promise to catch up. When everyone else left, Mrs. Henderson sat down at the desk next to mine, instead of staying behind her teacher desk. She looked tired, and for the first time, I noticed she was probably only in her early 30s, younger than I'd originally thought. Laura, she said, I've been watching you for 6 weeks now, and I need to ask you something. Are you planning to waste your entire education? The question caught me completely off guard. I'm not wasting anything, I said defensively. I'm passing all my classes. Passing, she repeated. Is that really your goal? To just barely pass? I shrugged. I mean, I'm doing fine. I don't need to be valedictorian or anything. Mrs. Henderson was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that hit me like a punch to the stomach. You're one of the smartest students I've taught this year, and you're choosing to be mediocre. That's not just disappointing, Laura. It's tragic. I felt my face get hot. You don't know anything about me. I know that when you actually engage in class discussions, your insights are thoughtful and original. I know that the one paper you clearly put effort into was brilliant. I know that you ask questions that show you're thinking critically about complex ideas. And I know that you're throwing all of that away because you've decided that trying doesn't matter. She leaned forward. Here's what I think happened. You're smart enough that elementary and middle school were easy for you. You never had to develop study habits or push yourself because everything came naturally. But now you're at the point where natural ability isn't enough anymore. And instead of learning how to work hard, you've decided to just accept being average. I wanted to argue with her, but everything she was saying felt true. I had always been the kid who finished tests first, who understood concepts while other students were still asking questions. But this year, for the first time, I was actually struggling with some of the material, and my response had been to just lower my expectations instead of raising my effort. The tragedy, Mrs. Henderson continued, is that you have so much potential, and you're choosing to waste it. Not because you can't do the work, but because you won't do the work. I started crying, which was embarrassing, but I couldn't help it. She was right, and hearing someone say it out loud made me realize how disappointed I was in myself. I don't know how to be better at this, I admitted. When things get hard, I just want to give up. That's exactly why you need to learn this now, she said, because life is going to keep getting harder, and if you don't develop the ability to push through difficulty, you're going to spend your whole life settling for less than what you're capable of. She pulled out a sheet of paper and wrote down her email address. Here's what we're going to do. You're going to redo every assignment you've turned in so far this semester. Not for a grade, just for practice. I want to see you actually try. And when you get stuck or frustrated, you're going to email me instead of giving up. I looked at the list of assignments and felt overwhelmed. This is going to take forever. Yes, she said. That's the point. You need to learn what it feels like to work hard at something that doesn't come easily. The next few months were brutal. I spent hours rewriting papers, analysing passages I'd previously skimmed, researching topics I'd never bothered to explore deeply. I emailed Mrs. Henderson constantly with questions, and she always responded with more questions that pushed me to think even harder. But something amazing started happening. The more effort I put in, the more I started enjoying the work. When I finally understood a complex theme or made a connection between different parts of the text, it felt incredible in a way that easy A's never had. My grades in all my classes started improving because I was applying the same work ethic everywhere. I discovered I actually loved learning when I was fully engaged instead of just going through the motions. By the end of 8th grade, I was getting A's in Mrs. Henderson's class, but more importantly, I had developed the study habits and persistence that carried me through high school and into college. I'm graduating this spring with honours, and I'm already accepted into graduate school. None of that would have happened if Mrs. Henderson hadn't called me out that day and forced me to confront my own mediocrity. I wrote her a letter my senior year of high school, thanking her for seeing potential in me that I couldn't see in myself, and for caring enough to push me when it would have been easier to just let me coast. She wrote back and said that conversation had been as hard for her as it was for me. She'd spent weeks debating whether to say something, worried she might discourage me instead of motivating me. But she said she couldn't watch a bright student waste their gifts without at least trying to intervene. I think about that moment a lot now, especially when I'm tempted to take the easy route, or when something feels too difficult to tackle. Mrs. Henderson showed me that the difference between who I was and who I could become was just a willingness to work hard when things got challenging. Sometimes the most important conversations are the ones that make you uncomfortable. She could have let me slide by with C's and mediocre effort, but instead she chose to tell me a truth I needed to hear, even though it was difficult for both of us. That story shows how one honest conversation can completely redirect someone's life trajectory. Mrs. Henderson saw potential being wasted and cared enough to risk making a student uncomfortable in service of their future. That takes real courage as an educator, knowing you might be the bad guy in the short term to help someone become their best self in the long run. Sometimes we need someone to hold up a mirror and show us who we're choosing to be. Here's our next story about discovering that betrayal can actually be a gift in disguise. The friend who lied about me. This happened during my junior year of high school, and it took me years to understand why it was actually one of the best things that could have happened to me. I'd been best friends with Tyler since middle school. We did everything together, had all the same interests, spent weekends at each other's houses. I thought we'd be friends forever. That loyalty we had was unbreakable. Tyler was one of those people who was naturally charismatic. Everyone liked him. Teachers thought he was great. And he had this way of making you feel special when you were in his inner circle. I felt lucky to be his closest friend. During junior year, I started dating this girl named Emma, who I really liked. She was smart, funny, and we had this easy connection that I'd never experienced before. Tyler seemed happy for me at first, making jokes about me being whipped and asking how things were going, but I started noticing weird things. Emma would mention conversations she'd had with Tyler that seemed more personal than I'd expected. He'd text her directly instead of going through me when we were making group plans. When I brought it up with him, he'd say he was just being friendly and trying to include her in our friend group. Then Emma started acting differently around me. She'd seem distant sometimes, like she was thinking about something she couldn't share. When I asked if everything was okay, she'd say she was fine, but I could tell something was bothering her. The truth came out during lunch one day when Emma pulled me aside, looking upset. She said she needed to tell me something that Tyler had said to her, but she'd been hoping she wouldn't have to. According to Emma, Tyler had been telling her that I talked about her behind her back. He said I'd complained about her being clingy, that I'd told him I was thinking about breaking up with her, but didn't know how. He'd also apparently shared some embarrassing personal things I told him in confidence, framing them as examples of how I wasn't ready for a serious relationship. I was shocked. None of it was true. I'd never said anything negative about Emma to Tyler or anyone else. In fact, I'd been telling Tyler how happy I was with her, how much I liked her. When I confronted Tyler about it, he denied everything at first, said Emma must have misunderstood or that she was trying to cause drama between us. But when I pressed him with specific details, his story started falling apart. Eventually, he admitted he'd made up the stories about me, but claimed he was trying to protect Emma. He said he thought I wasn't treating her well and that she deserved to know the truth about how I really felt. I was devastated. This was my best friend, someone I'd trusted completely, and he'd been systematically lying to sabotage my relationship. But what hurt even more was realizing this probably wasn't the first time. I started thinking back to other situations where Tyler had been involved in drama or conflict, and I began to see patterns I'd missed before. Emma and I managed to work through it because she'd been smart enough to come to me directly instead of just believing what Tyler had told her. But my friendship with Tyler was over. I couldn't trust someone who would lie about me to hurt my relationship, especially when he was supposed to be my closest friend. The fallout was socially complicated because Tyler was popular, and our friend group didn't know what to believe. Some people took his side, thinking I was overreacting or that Emma was causing problems. Others stayed neutral, which felt almost worse than if they'd just picked a side. For a while, I felt isolated and questioned my own judgment. If my best friend could deceive me so thoroughly, how could I trust anyone? I became more guarded in friendships, always looking for signs that people might not be who they seemed. But something interesting happened over the following months. The friends who stayed loyal during the drama turned out to be incredibly solid people. My friend Marcus, who I'd been casual friends with before, stepped up and became someone I could really depend on. Sarah, who I barely knew, made an effort to include me in group activities when others were avoiding me because of the Tyler situation. I also developed a much closer relationship with Emma because we'd been through this challenging situation together. Instead of letting Tyler's lies drive us apart, we'd chosen to communicate honestly with each other, and that foundation made our relationship stronger. Most importantly, I learned to recognize red flags that I'd been blind to before. The way Tyler always seemed to be at the center of drama, how he'd share personal information about mutual friends, the subtle way he'd undermine other people while appearing supportive. These were patterns I'd missed because I'd been so close to the situation. A year later, I heard that Tyler had done something similar to another friend, spreading rumors and trying to manipulate a situation for his own benefit. By then, several people had started to see through his charm and realize that he wasn't as trustworthy as he appeared. Looking back now, I'm actually grateful that Tyler showed me who he really was when I was 17, instead of when I was 27 and the stakes were higher. I learned to value friends who were consistent and honest over friends who were just exciting and charismatic. I developed better instincts about who deserved my trust and loyalty. The experience also taught me to communicate directly with people instead of believing second-hand information, no matter who it comes from. If Emma hadn't come to me with her concerns, Tyler's lies could have destroyed our relationship without either of us understanding why. Tyler did me a favor by revealing his true character, even though it hurt at the time. He showed me what real loyalty looks like by demonstrating its absence. The friends who stood by me during that difficult period proved they were worth keeping, and the ones who didn't showed me they were fair-weather friends anyway. Sometimes, betrayal is just clarity in disguise. It forces you to see people as they really are instead of as you hoped they were, and that knowledge is invaluable even when it's painful to acquire. That betrayal was brutal, but necessary. Tyler essentially did the work of filtering your social circle for you, showing you which relationships were built on substance versus convenience. The people who stayed proved their character, and you learned to spot manipulation tactics early. Sometimes the worst friends teach you the most about what real friendship should look like. Let's move to a story about how a simple failure can become the foundation for genuine confidence. The day I failed my driving test. I know this sounds dramatic for something so ordinary, but failing my driving test was actually one of the most important experiences of my teenage years. I'd been counting down to my 16th birthday for months. All my friends who were older had their licenses, and I was tired of being the one who always needed rides. I'd done the required hours of practice with my parents, taken the driver's ed course, and felt completely ready. The morning of my test, I was nervous but confident. I'd been driving around town with my mum for weeks, parking, parallel parking, doing three-point turns. I knew all the rules, had memorised the hand signals, and had practiced the test route with my dad until I could do it perfectly. The driving instructor was this older man who looked bored and slightly annoyed to be there. He barely made eye contact when he introduced himself and immediately started checking things off on his clipboard. I tried to make small talk to ease my nerves, but he just grunted responses and told me to start the car. Everything started fine. I adjusted my mirrors, checked my blind spots, signalled properly when leaving the parking lot. I was feeling good about how smoothly everything was going. Then we got to the parallel parking section, which I'd practiced hundreds of times. For some reason, maybe because I was being watched so closely, I completely choked. I couldn't judge the distance correctly, kept ending up too far from the curb, had to start over multiple times. The instructor was making notes on his clipboard, which made me even more nervous. After the fourth attempt at parallel parking, he told me to just move on to the 3-point turn. But by then, my confidence was shattered. I was second-guessing every movement, oversteering, taking too long to make decisions. The smooth, confident driving I'd been doing with my parents was replaced by jerky, hesitant movements. When we got back to the DMV, the instructor handed me the clipboard and pointed to a big red fail stamp at the top. He listed off my mistakes: inadequate parallel parking, failure to maintain consistent speed, improper mirror usage during lane changes. I felt like crying right there in the parking lot. All my friends had passed their tests on the first try, and here I was, failing at something I'd been so sure I was ready for. My mum was waiting inside, and I had to walk in and tell her I'd failed. She was supportive, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes. The worst part was facing my friends at school the next day. When they asked how the test went, I had to admit I'd failed. Some of them were genuinely sympathetic, but others made jokes about how easy the driving test was and how they couldn't believe anyone could fail it. I felt embarrassed and frustrated with myself. I'd been so cocky going into the test, so sure that I was ready, and the failure felt like proof that I wasn't as competent as I'd thought. But my dad had a different perspective. When I told him what had happened, he said something that stuck with me. Good. Now you know what you actually need to work on, instead of just thinking you're ready. He was right. I'd been practicing, but not really challenging myself. I'd been doing the same routes, the same parking spots, always with my parents who made me feel comfortable and confident. I hadn't prepared for the pressure of being tested by a stranger or for situations that didn't go exactly as planned. So instead of scheduling my retest immediately, I spent the next month really practicing. I drove in different neighbourhoods, practiced parallel parking between different sized cars, drove during rush hour traffic, practiced in rain and at night. My parents started being more critical during practice sessions, pointing out mistakes I'd been making that they'd previously overlooked. Most importantly, I learned to recover when things went wrong. Instead of getting flustered and making more mistakes, I practiced staying calm and correcting course. I learned that making one mistake didn't mean I had to panic and make 10 more mistakes. When I took the test again 6 weeks later, I felt completely different. Not overconfident this time, but genuinely prepared. I knew I could handle unexpected situations because I'd practiced for them. When the parallel parking didn't go perfectly on the first try, I calmly adjusted and got it right the second time instead of panicking. I passed easily, and the instructor even complimented me on my smooth, confident driving. But more than just getting my license, I'd learned something important about preparation and resilience. That experience taught me not to confuse familiarity with mastery. Just because I could drive well with my parents didn't mean I was ready for the real test. I learned the difference between practicing until you can do something right and practicing until you can't do it wrong. The lesson extended far beyond driving. When I was preparing for college entrance exams, I made sure to take practice tests under timed conditions instead of just studying the material. When I was interviewing for jobs, I practiced answering difficult questions instead of just assuming I'd figure it out in the moment. Failing that driving test taught me that real confidence comes from being truly prepared, not from thinking you're ready. It showed me that setbacks can actually make you stronger if you use them as information about what you need to improve, rather than evidence that you're not capable. I'm glad I failed that test. It taught me humility and the value of thorough preparation. The second time I passed, I knew I'd earned it, and that made getting my license feel like a real accomplishment instead of just something I was entitled to. Sometimes the worst endings bring the clearest lessons, about self-worth. Sometimes I realized that person wasn't the exception to my boundaries. They were exactly why I needed them in the first place. Our next story comes from someone who learned that not all relationships are meant to last forever, and that's actually okay. The friend who drifted away. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, especially now that social media keeps showing me updates from people I used to know so well it felt like we shared the same brain. Her name was Kelly, and we were inseparable from 3rd grade through high school graduation. We had that kind of friendship where we could spend entire weekends together and never run out of things to talk about. We made up secret languages, had elaborate inside jokes that would send us into fits of laughter at the most inappropriate times, and genuinely believed we'd be best friends forever. When we graduated, we cried harder about leaving each other than about leaving our boyfriends or our families. We promised we'd talk every day, visit constantly, be each other's maids of honor, and raise our kids together like sisters. The whole dramatic teenage friendship thing, but it felt so real and permanent at the time. For the first year after graduation, we kept that promise. Daily phone calls that lasted hours, constant texting, care packages sent back and forth between our colleges. When she got her heart broken by some guy in her dorm, I drove 3 hours just to bring her ice cream and tissues. When I was struggling with my chemistry class, she'd stay up late helping me study over video chat. But slowly, things started changing. The phone calls got shorter and less frequent. She'd tell me about people I'd never met, reference experiences I wasn't part of, mention plans with friends whose names I didn't recognize. I was doing the same thing, talking about my roommates and my study group and the guy I was seeing, but somehow it felt different when she did it. By sophomore year, our conversations started feeling forced. We'd both clearly grown and changed, but we were trying so hard to maintain the dynamic we'd had in high school that we weren't letting ourselves be who we were becoming. She'd ask about people from our hometown that I'd lost touch with, and I'd ask about her classes when what she really wanted to talk about was this new internship she was excited about. The drift became obvious during winter break, our junior year. She was home for 3 weeks, and we made plans to hang out multiple times. But every time we got together, it felt awkward and stilted. We'd run out of things to say after an hour, or we'd fall back on reminiscing about high school instead of talking about our current lives. I remember sitting in her childhood bedroom, looking at all the photos of us on her bulletin board, and feeling like I was looking at strangers. Not because I didn't care about her, but because we'd both become such different people than the girls in those pictures. After that visit, we both stopped trying as hard. The daily texts became weekly, then monthly, then just birthday wishes and major life updates. We'd like each other's Instagram posts and send the occasional thinking of you message, but we both knew something had fundamentally shifted. For a long time, I felt guilty about letting the friendship fade. I wondered if I should have tried harder, been more interested in her new life, made more effort to visit or call. I felt like I was failing at something important, like I was a bad friend for not fighting to maintain a connection that had once meant everything to me. But I've been thinking about it differently lately. Not every friendship is meant to last your entire lifetime, and that doesn't diminish how important it was during the time it existed. Kelly and I had exactly the friendship we both needed from ages 8 to 18. She taught me how to be loyal, how to keep secrets, how to laugh until my stomach hurt, how to support someone through their worst moments. We were perfect friends for who we were then, but we grew into people who needed different things from their relationships. Trying to force our childhood dynamic to work for our adult selves would have been like trying to wear clothes that no longer fit. Technically possible, but uncomfortable for everyone involved. I saw on Facebook that Kelly got engaged last month. I sent her a congratulations message, and she responded with genuine warmth and excitement. We didn't try to catch up or make plans, but there was love in that exchange. Love for who we used to be to each other, and acceptance of who we are now. I think that's what I've learned about friendship as an adult. Some friends are meant to walk the whole journey with you. Others are meant to be intensely important for specific chapters, teaching you what you need to learn during that particular season of your life. Both types of friendship are valuable and meaningful. Kelly helped shape who I am in ways that will always be part of me. She taught me what it felt like to be truly known by another person, what it meant to have someone choose you as family, even when they didn't have to. Those lessons didn't disappear when our friendship evolved. Sometimes love means holding on tightly. Sometimes it means letting go gracefully. Kelly and I chose the second option, and I think we were both wise enough to recognise that our friendship had run its natural course. It ended not because we stopped caring, but because we cared enough to let each other grow into the people we were becoming. That story captures something so universal yet rarely talked about. Friendship breakups can be just as painful as romantic ones, maybe more so because there's no script for how to handle them. But recognising when someone was meant for a season rather than a lifetime actually honours what you shared instead of diminishing it. Some chapters are beautiful precisely because they know when to end. Let's move to a story about discovering that your worth isn't determined by other people's recognition. The boss who never noticed my work. I need to get this out because it took me way too long to learn this lesson. And I'm hoping maybe it'll help someone else figure it out faster than I did. I was working at this marketing firm right after college, so eager to prove myself and make a good impression. I'd always been the type of person who believed that hard work automatically led to recognition. Work harder than everyone else, stay later, go above and beyond on every project, and eventually people will notice and reward you for it. That's what I'd been taught growing up, and it had worked pretty well in school. My boss Marcus was one of those managers who talked a big game about teamwork and appreciating his staff, but when it came to actually acknowledging individual contributions, he had serious blind spots. There were clearly people on our team who could do no wrong in his eyes, and others who seemed to be invisible no matter what they accomplished. I threw myself into every project like my career depended on it. When we had client presentations, I'd stay until midnight, perfecting the slides while my co-workers left at 5. When someone needed help with their workload, I'd volunteer even if it meant working weekends. I created detailed reports that weren't required, came up with innovative solutions to problems that had been frustrating everyone, and consistently exceeded every target they set for me. For months, I watched Marcus praise other team members for work that was honestly just adequate while completely overlooking my contributions. In meetings, he'd acknowledge everyone else's input but somehow skip over mine. When clients complimented our campaigns directly to him, he'd thank the team generally but never mention specific people, even when I'd done most of the actual work. The breaking point came during our quarterly performance reviews. I'd prepared extensively, documenting all my achievements, the extra projects I'd taken on, the positive feedback from clients. I was sure this would be when Marcus finally acknowledged how much I'd been contributing to the team's success. Instead, he gave me the most generic review I've ever received. Standard feedback about continuing to develop professionally and maintaining good work quality. No mention of the campaign I'd single-handedly saved when another team member dropped the ball at the last minute. No recognition of the weekend I'd spent fixing a major client crisis that could have cost us the account. No acknowledgement of the process improvements I'd implemented that were saving everyone time and money. Meanwhile, I heard through office gossip that 2 of my co-workers, who barely met deadlines and left early most days, had gotten glowing reviews and were being considered for promotions. I went home that night and seriously considered quitting. I felt invisible, unappreciated, like all my effort had been completely wasted. I started questioning whether I was actually good at my job or if I was just deluding myself about the quality of my work. But something my dad said during a phone call that weekend stuck with me. He told me that you can't control whether other people notice your work, but you can control whether you respect yourself for the effort you put in. He said the goal shouldn't be external validation, but internal satisfaction with knowing you'd done your best. That Monday, I made a decision that changed everything. I was going to keep doing excellent work, not because I expected Marcus to finally notice, but because that's who I wanted to be as a professional. I was going to take pride in my own standards, regardless of whether anyone else appreciated them. Something weird happened once I stopped working for Marcus's approval and started working for my own satisfaction. I actually enjoyed my job more. I wasn't constantly frustrated by his lack of recognition because I wasn't depending on him for validation. I knew when I'd done something well, and that knowledge was enough. About 6 months later, one of our biggest clients specifically requested to work with me on a new campaign. They told Marcus they'd been impressed with my work on previous projects and wanted me to lead their account personally. Suddenly, Marcus was very interested in keeping me happy. He offered me a raise, more responsibilities, and started acknowledging my contributions in meetings. But by then, I'd already started interviewing at other companies. I ended up taking a position at a smaller firm where my boss actually pays attention to the quality of work people do. I've been there for over a year now, and the difference is incredible. My contributions are noticed, my ideas are valued, and I'm already being considered for advancement. Here's what I learned from those months with Marcus. Your worth as a professional isn't determined by whether one person recognizes it. Some managers are just bad at their jobs, and that has nothing to do with your value as an employee. The work ethic and standards you develop for yourself matter more than any single person's opinion of them. I'm actually grateful for that experience now, even though it was frustrating at the time. It taught me to find internal motivation and satisfaction in doing things well. It showed me what kind of work environment I deserved and taught me not to settle for less. And it proved that when you consistently do excellent work, the right people will eventually notice, even if it takes longer than you'd like. Marcus is still at that company, by the way. From what I hear through mutual connections, he cycled through 4 more employees in my old position. Turns out when you don't recognize or develop good people, they leave. And eventually, that pattern catches up with you. Working for someone who can't see your value is like trying to water a plant with a broken watering can. The problem isn't your effort, it's their equipment. Marcus probably wondered why he kept losing good employees without ever connecting it to his own blind spots. Sometimes the best career move is recognizing when your growth has outpaced your environment. Here's a story about discovering community in the most unexpected moment. The neighbor who shared soup during a storm. I've been thinking about this memory a lot lately, especially with how disconnected everything feels these days. This happened about 4 years ago during one of the worst winter storms our area had seen in decades. I'd just moved into my first apartment completely by myself. It was this old building with thin walls and windows that rattled when the wind picked up. But it was mine, and I was proud of that independence. I didn't really know any of my neighbours yet. I'd see them in the hallway occasionally, exchange polite nods, but we all kept to ourselves like people do in apartment buildings. The storm hit on a Wednesday night. I'd been tracking the weather all week, stocking up on candles and non-perishable food like everyone else in the city. By evening, the wind was howling so loud it sounded like freight trains passing right outside my window. The snow was coming down sideways, and I could hear tree branches snapping under the weight of the ice. Around 10 o'clock, the power went out. Not just in my building, but everywhere I could see. I looked out my window and the whole neighbourhood was dark except for the occasional flicker of flashlights or phone screens. My apartment got cold incredibly fast, and I realised my preparations hadn't been as thorough as I'd thought. I'd bought plenty of crackers and canned food, but nothing that would actually warm me up. My phone was at about 30% battery, and I was trying to conserve it for emergencies. I wrapped myself in every blanket I owned and settled in for what I figured would be a long, miserable night. Then around 11:30, I heard a soft knock at my door. I was hesitant to answer because honestly, who knocks on strangers' doors during a blackout? But the knocking was gentle, not threatening, so I cracked the door open while keeping the chain latched. Standing in the hallway was my neighbour from across the hall, holding a thermos and a flashlight. I'd seen her a few times before, an older woman, maybe in her 50s, with kind eyes and greying hair. I think her name was Margaret, but we'd never actually introduced ourselves properly. "I'm so sorry to bother you," she said, "but I made a big pot of soup before the power went out and it's still warm. I thought you might like some since it's getting pretty cold in here." I was so touched I almost started crying. Here was this woman I barely knew, checking on me during a storm, offering to share her food. I unlatched the chain and opened the door properly. "That's incredibly kind of you," I said. "I'm actually pretty unprepared for this." She smiled and handed me the thermos. "We all learn these things as we go. I've lived through enough storms to know what helps." The soup was this amazing homemade chicken and vegetable blend, still steaming hot. I invited her in, and we ended up sitting in my living room by candlelight, sharing the soup and talking for over an hour. She told me about the building's history, about other storms she'd weathered, about her grandchildren who lived across the country. I learned that Margaret had been a teacher for 35 years, that she loved gardening but missed having a yard, that she worried about the young people in the building, not knowing their neighbours. She had this gentle way of listening that made me want to share more than I usually would with someone I'd just met. When the soup was gone, she gathered her thermos and flashlight. "If you need anything else tonight, don't hesitate to knock," she said. "And tomorrow, once this passes, maybe we can check on some other neighbours together." After she left, I realised I wasn't cold anymore, and not just because of the soup. There was something about that unexpected kindness that warmed me from the inside out. I'd been so focused on being independent and self-sufficient that I'd forgotten how good it felt to be cared for by someone, even a stranger. The power came back on the next afternoon, but Margaret and I kept our promise to check on other neighbours. We discovered that Mrs. Chen on the 3rd floor had been without heat all night, and that the college student in 2B had run out of food entirely. We organised an impromptu building dinner that weekend, and suddenly this place, that had felt like a collection of strangers, started feeling like a community. Margaret and I became real friends after that storm. She taught me how to make her soup recipe. I helped her set up a small herb garden on the fire escape. When she had surgery last year, I was the one driving her to appointments and picking up groceries. When I was going through a rough breakup, she was the one listening over tea and homemade cookies. What started as a simple act of kindness during a blackout turned into one of the most meaningful friendships I've ever had. It taught me that community isn't something that just happens, it's something you create by reaching out, even in small ways. I think about that knock on my door a lot now. How easy it would have been for Margaret to just eat her soup alone and assume everyone else was fine. How different my life might have been if she hadn't taken that small step to check on a neighbour she barely knew. Sometimes the most important connections happen when everything else falls apart. That story gives me chills because it shows how crisis can reveal the best in people. Margaret could have stayed warm in her own apartment, but instead she thought about others first. Those moments of unexpected kindness during difficult times often become the foundation for lifelong connections. It's proof that community isn't built through grand gestures, but through showing up with soup when the lights go out. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that the hardest experiences sometimes forge the strongest character, the coach who pushed me too hard. This is something I've been thinking about a lot lately, especially now that I'm older and can see the bigger picture of what was actually happening during what felt like torture at the time. I was 15 and had just made the varsity soccer team, mostly because they needed bodies rather than because I was particularly talented. I was decent enough, but definitely not used to the intensity of varsity level training. Coach Martinez had a reputation for being tough, but I figured I was ready for whatever she could dish out. I was completely wrong. The first practice, she had us running suicides until 2 girls threw up. Then we did passing drills where if you missed your target, the whole team had to start over. I'd never experienced anything like it. In JV, if you messed up, you just tried again. Here, your mistakes affected everyone, and you felt that weight immediately. Coach Martinez had this way of looking at you that made you feel like she could see every weakness, every moment you wanted to quit. She'd call you out in front of everyone. "Sarah, you're jogging, not running. Do you think jogging will win games?" Sarah, that pass was lazy. Lazy players sit on the bench. After 2 weeks, I was dreading practice every single day. I'd sit in my last class before soccer, stomach in knots, trying to convince myself I was sick so I could skip. Some days I'd actually go to the nurse's office with mysterious headaches or stomach aches. But something kept bringing me back. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was fear of being seen as a quitter. The worst practice happened about a month in. We were scrimmaging against the boys' JV team, which Coach Martinez called a character-building exercise. The boys were bigger, faster, and clearly not taking it easy on us because we were girls. They were playing physical, trash-talking, basically trying to intimidate us off the ball. I was getting frustrated because I kept losing possession, and Coach Martinez kept yelling at me to be stronger, to fight for the ball. You're playing like you're afraid of contact, Sarah. Soccer isn't a gentle sport. Akio, finally I snapped. I yelled back at her, maybe if you actually taught us something instead of just screaming at us, we'd be better. The field went dead silent. Everyone stopped playing and stared. Coach Martinez blew her whistle and walked over to me slowly. I thought I was about to get kicked off the team, and honestly, part of me was relieved. But instead of yelling, she spoke quietly, so only I could hear. Meet me after practice. We need to talk. Those 2 hours of practice felt like forever. I was convinced she was going to humiliate me in front of everyone, or make me run until I collapsed. When everyone else left, I prepared for the worst. Sit down, she said, pointing to the bleachers. Tell me what you think my job is. I was confused. To coach soccer? Be more specific, I thought about it. To teach us plays and skills, and how to win games? She shook her head. My job is to prepare you for things that are harder than soccer. Every time you want to quit during a difficult drill, and you don't, you're building something inside yourself that you'll need later. Every time you get knocked down and get back up, every time you push through when your body wants to stop, you're becoming someone who can handle whatever life throws at you. She continued, You think I'm being mean, but I'm showing you that you're stronger than you know. That moment when you yelled at me, that was the first time I've seen you fight for anything. I'd rather have a player who fights back than one who just takes whatever comes. I started crying, which was embarrassing, but she didn't seem to mind. I don't know if I'm strong enough for this, I said. You are, she said simply. You've been coming to practice for 5 weeks, even though you hate it. That's not weakness, that's courage. Now I need you to trust that I know what I'm doing. Something shifted after that conversation. I started seeing the brutal practices differently. When she made us run extra laps because someone missed a shot, I focused on the fact that I was getting stronger. When she criticised my form, I tried to hear the instruction instead of the criticism. When scrimmages got physical, I leaned into the contact instead of shying away. By the end of the season, I was starting midfielder. Not because I was the most talented, but because I'd become someone who didn't give up when things got difficult. I was the player who would chase down every ball, who would encourage teammates when they wanted to quit, who would keep running even when we were losing badly. That mental toughness Coach Martinez forced me to develop ended up serving me way beyond soccer. When I struggled through calculus senior year, I remembered how to push through frustration instead of giving up. When I was overwhelmed freshman year of college, I knew I could handle more stress than I thought. When I was job hunting after graduation and facing rejection after rejection, I had the resilience to keep applying. I ran into Coach Martinez at a coffee shop last year, almost 10 years after graduating. I thanked her for being so hard on us, and she smiled. You girls taught me as much as I taught you. Watching you all discover your own strength was the best part of coaching. She retired from coaching 3 years ago, but I heard she still gets letters from former players thanking her for pushing them beyond what they thought they could handle. She built something in all of us that we couldn't see at the time, something that only reveals itself when life gets difficult. I'm grateful now for every brutal practice, every moment I wanted to quit but didn't. Coach Martinez was right about preparing us for things harder than soccer. The hardest lessons often feel the most unfair when you're learning them. Sometimes, the people who push you the hardest are the ones who believe in you the most. Coach Martinez saw potential that her players couldn't see in themselves, and she was willing to be the bad guy to help them find it. That kind of tough love is rare because it requires someone to prioritize your growth over your comfort. The strength you don't know you have only emerges when someone refuses to let you quit. Here's our next story about how losing everything can sometimes lead you exactly where you needed to go. The time I lost my job. I'm actually writing this from my own office now, in a business I never imagined I'd have the courage to start. But let me tell you how losing the job I thought I wanted led me to the life I actually needed. 2.5 years ago, I was working as a marketing coordinator at Morrison & Associates, a mid-sized advertising firm downtown. I was so excited when they hired me. Finally, a real grown-up job with benefits and a decent salary. The office was sleek and modern, the work seemed creative and important, and I felt like I was finally on track to build the kind of career I'd always pictured. For the first 1.5 years, everything seemed fine. I was learning the ropes, working on campaigns for local businesses, slowly building relationships with clients and co-workers. My boss Janet seemed pleased with my work. I was getting positive feedback on my campaigns and felt like I was making real progress toward the senior coordinator position that would open up eventually. But things started shifting when the company hired a new creative director. Paul came from a bigger firm in Chicago and immediately started making changes to fit what he called industry best practices. Betrayal. A lot of the creative freedom we'd had before disappeared, replaced by rigid processes and approval chains. I tried to adapt to Paul's new systems, but it was clear from early on that he had his favourites, and I wasn't one of them. The people he'd brought from Chicago got the interesting projects, while those of us who'd been there longer were assigned more routine work. When I tried to contribute ideas in meetings, Paul would dismiss them or assign them to someone else to develop. The writing was on the wall for months before anything official happened. I'd hear whispers about budget cuts and restructuring. Certain projects were being moved to Paul's inner circle, and I was increasingly left out of important client meetings. Janet seemed apologetic but powerless to change the direction things were heading. On a Tuesday morning in March, Janet called me into her office. She looked uncomfortable, kept fidgeting with papers on her desk. "I'm so sorry, but we're going to have to let you go. Paul is restructuring the department, and your position is being eliminated." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. I kept asking what I'd done wrong, if there was anything I could have done differently. Janet assured me it wasn't about my performance, just about the company's new direction. But it didn't make the rejection sting any less. I cleaned out my desk in a daze, carrying a cardboard box of personal items past co-workers who couldn't quite meet my eyes. The whole experience was humiliating and confusing. I'd thought I was building something stable, and suddenly I was unemployed with no warning and no plan. The first few weeks were dark. I spent most days in my pajamas scrolling through job listings that all seemed to require experience I didn't have, or skills I hadn't developed. I sent out dozens of applications and got very few responses. When I did get interviews, I felt desperate and defeated, which probably came across to potential employers. My savings were running low, and I was starting to panic about rent and bills. I took a part-time job at a coffee shop, just to have some income coming in, but I felt like I was moving backward professionally. All my friends were advancing in their careers, while I was steaming milk and taking orders from college students. But something interesting started happening during those long shifts at the coffee shop. I began talking to the customers, really listening to their stories. There was this woman, Maria, who came in every morning before opening her small bakery down the street. She was always stressed about marketing her business, trying to figure out how to reach more customers without spending money she didn't have. I found myself giving her advice about social media and local advertising. Nothing fancy, just basic stuff I'd learned at Morrison & Associates. She started implementing my suggestions, and within a few weeks, she was seeing real results. More customers, busier weekends, positive reviews online. Maria insisted on paying me for the help, but I just enjoyed seeing her business grow. Word spread to other small business owners in the area, and soon I had 3 or 4 people asking for marketing advice. I was doing it informally at first, just meeting people for coffee and brainstorming ideas. But then I realized I was actually good at this, better than I'd been at Morrison & Associates, because now I was working with people who genuinely needed help and appreciated creative solutions. These small business owners couldn't afford big advertising budgets, so I had to be resourceful and innovative in ways I'd never had to be before. 6 months after losing my job, I officially started my own marketing consultancy, specializing in small businesses and local entrepreneurs. I was terrified, had no idea what I was doing from a business standpoint, but I knew I could help these clients in ways that big firms couldn't or wouldn't. It's been almost 2 years now, and my business has grown beyond anything I imagined. I have 12 regular clients. I'm making more money than I ever did at Morrison & Associates, and I wake up every morning excited about the work I'm doing. I'm helping people build their dreams instead of selling products they don't really believe in. The crazy part is, I never would have had the courage to start my own business if I hadn't been forced out of my comfortable job. I would have stayed at Morrison & Associates for years, probably getting increasingly frustrated but too scared to make a change. I heard through mutual friends that Paul's restructuring at Morrison & Associates didn't go well. They lost several major clients and had to lay off more people. Meanwhile, I'm working with passionate entrepreneurs who trust me to help them grow their businesses. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is actually the best thing that could have happened. I just couldn't see it at the time. Here's the next story, and I think this one's going to resonate with a lot of you. The breakup that saved my career. I never thought I'd be grateful for the worst night of my life, but here we are, 3 years later, and I finally understand what people mean when they say everything happens for a reason. I was with my ex for almost 4 years. We met in college, moved in together after graduation, and I genuinely thought we were building something permanent. But there was this constant tension that I couldn't quite put my finger off. Every time I talked about my goals, my dreams of working in environmental journalism, there was this look that would cross their face. Not support, not excitement, just this subtle eye roll followed by comments about how competitive the field was, how unrealistic my expectations were, how maybe I should focus on something more stable. I started believing it. I took a job at a local insurance company because it was steady, because it made sense, because it made them happy. I told myself I was being responsible, mature, practical, but every morning felt like swallowing glass. I'd sit in my cubicle processing claims and watch my college friends posting about their internships at magazines, their bylines in local papers, their adventures covering stories that actually mattered. Whenever I brought up maybe taking a writing class or applying for a journalism fellowship, or even just starting a blog, the response was always the same. You have a good thing going. Why rock the boat? You're not 22 anymore. You can't just chase pipe dreams. The breaking point came when I got offered an interview for a junior position at an environmental nonprofit. It was everything I'd ever wanted. Decent pay, meaningful work, the chance to actually write about issues I cared about. I was so excited, I could barely contain myself when I got home that night. Their reaction was immediate and crushing. Are you serious right now? You want to throw away a stable job for some non-profit that could fold tomorrow? What about our plans? What about the house we're supposed to buy? What about being realistic for once in your life? That fight lasted 3 days. 3 days of them listing every reason why I wasn't cut out for journalism, why I was being selfish, why I was going to ruin our future together. On the third night, I was lying in bed staring at the ceiling, and I realised something that made my blood run cold. I had stopped dreaming. Somewhere along the way, I had let someone else's fear become my reality. The next morning I went to the interview. I didn't tell them I was going, I just went. And you know what? I nailed it. The editor loved my writing samples. We talked for 2 hours about climate policy and investigative techniques, and they offered me the position on the spot. When I got home that evening, glowing with excitement and ready to share the best news of my life, I was met with an ultimatum. Take the safe job or lose the relationship. Choose stability or choose selfishness. Choose us or choose some fantasy career that would probably fail anyway. I chose myself. The breakup was brutal. 4 years of shared history, mutual friends, intertwined lives, all of it imploded in one devastating week. I moved out, crashed on my sister's couch, and started my new job while nursing a heartbreak that felt like it might actually kill me. But here's the thing about removing dead weight from your life. Suddenly you can fly. Within 6 months, I had written 3 articles that got picked up by major publications. Within a year, I was covering the state legislature and building sources I never could have imagined. Within 2 years, I was offered a position at a national environmental magazine that I literally used to keep on my coffee table and dream about writing for. I'm not saying the breakup didn't hurt. I grieved that relationship hard, but I also grieved the version of myself I had been slowly killing to make someone else comfortable. The version that had learned to make herself smaller, to want less, to dream quieter. Now I wake up excited about my work. I travel to cover stories, I've won 2 journalism awards, and I'm working on a book about climate activism that already has publisher interest. I'm dating someone new who reads every single article I write and sends them to their friends because they're proud of what I do, who encourages me to apply for bigger opportunities and celebrates my wins like they're their own. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed, if I'd chosen the safe relationship over the uncertain career. And honestly, it terrifies me, not because of what I would have missed professionally, but because of who I would have never become. The person I am now, the confident writer who pitches editors and interviews politicians and travels solo to investigate stories, she would have died in that cubicle. She would have suffocated under the weight of someone else's limitations. I'm not saying everyone should blow up their relationship to chase their dreams, but I am saying this. If someone truly loves you, they want to see you become the fullest version of yourself, not a smaller version that makes them feel safer. Love should be the wind in your sails, not the anchor dragging you down. The breakup that I thought would ruin my life actually saved it. And 3 years later, I've never been more grateful to have my heart broken by someone who couldn't handle my success. That story just hits different, doesn't it? There's something so powerful about realizing that the person you thought was your safe harbor was actually the storm keeping you from reaching shore. Sometimes, the most painful endings are just life making room for the beginning you actually deserve. It's wild how we can mistake someone holding us back for someone holding us steady. Let's move into our next story, and this one's about a different kind of relationship that went sideways. The friend who took advantage of my kindness. I've always been the friend people call when they need something. Need a ride to the airport? Call Kelly. Need someone to help you move? Kelly's got a truck. Need to borrow money until payday? Kelly's good for it. For the longest time, I thought this meant I was a good friend. Turns out, I was just a convenient one. Sarah and I met during our freshman year of college. We bonded over late-night study sessions and shared complaints about our statistics professor. She was funny, smart, and had this way of making even the most boring lecture feel like an inside joke between us. When we graduated and both ended up in the same city, I was thrilled to have a familiar face nearby. That first year, after college, was rough for both of us. Entry-level jobs, tiny apartments, the whole adjustment to adult life thing. We'd meet for dinner at cheap restaurants and split appetizers, commiserate about our bosses, dream about the day we'd finally feel like real grown-ups. It felt like we were figuring it out together. The first time Sarah asked to borrow money, it was completely understandable. Her car had broken down and she needed $400 for repairs. She'd pay me back as soon as her next paycheck came through. Of course I said yes, that's what friends do, right? 2 weeks later, she handed me cash and thanked me profusely. See? Good friend. Reliable friend. The kind of friend who shows up when life gets messy. But then it started happening more often. Her rent was due, but her paycheck was delayed. Her credit card bill was higher than expected. Her sister needed help with something, and Sarah was the only one who could assist. But she was a little short this month. Always legitimate reasons. Always temporary situations. Always paid back eventually. I started keeping a mental tab. Not because I didn't trust her, but because I'm careful with money, and I needed to make sure I wasn't overextending myself. 50 here, 100 there, sometimes 200 or 300 for bigger emergencies. Over the course of 2 years, I lent Sarah probably close to $3,000 total. What I didn't notice right away was the pattern of our friendship. Sarah would disappear for weeks at a time, not responding to texts about grabbing coffee or seeing a movie. But the moment she needed something, my phone would light up with messages. Long, chatty texts about how much she missed me, how we needed to catch up soon, how grateful she was to have such an amazing friend in her life. The requests got more creative. Could I cover her portion of a group dinner because she'd forgotten her wallet? Could I pick up groceries for both of us since she was working late and she'd pay me back next week? Could I lend her my car for the weekend because hers was making weird noises and she couldn't afford to fix it right now? I said yes to all of it because that's what friendship looked like to me. Being there, being helpful, being the person someone could count on. It wasn't until my other friend Emma pointed it out that I started to see what was actually happening. We were talking about Sarah over coffee, and I mentioned that I hadn't heard from her in a month, which was unusual. "When was the last time you heard from her?" Emma asked. I thought about it. Actually, she texted me yesterday, asking if she could borrow my Netflix password. "Kelly," Emma said gently, "when was the last time Sarah contacted you when she didn't need something?" I opened my phone and scrolled through our text history. Request for money. Request for a favour. Long gap. Another request, another gap. Request for help moving. Gap. Request to borrow my car. Gap. Going back months, the pattern was unmistakable. "She only calls when she needs something," I said out loud, and hearing it made my stomach sink. "Have you ever needed something from her?" Emma asked. I thought about it. The time my grandmother died and I was devastated. Sarah had been too busy to come to the funeral. The time I got food poisoning and was stuck in bed for 3 days. Sarah had been out of town. The time I got a promotion at work and wanted to celebrate. Sarah had plans she couldn't change. I realised I had trained myself not to need things from Sarah because she was never available when I actually needed support. I had learned to be the giver in our friendship because being the receiver was consistently disappointing. That night, I made a decision. The next time Sarah asked for something, I was going to say no. Not to be mean, not to punish her, but to see what happened to our friendship when I wasn't useful. I didn't have to wait long. 3 days later, Sarah texted asking if she could borrow $200 for her car insurance payment. Her usual chatty preamble about missing me and wanting to catch up soon. "I'm not able to lend money right now," I texted back, "but I'd love to grab coffee this weekend if you want to catch up." I never heard back. 3 months later, she texted again. Same friendly tone, same request for money, same promise that we needed to hang out soon. I declined and suggested we meet for lunch instead. Radio silence. It took 6 more months and 2 more identical interactions before I finally accepted the truth. Sarah didn't want my friendship. She wanted my wallet. The moment I stopped being useful, I stopped existing to her. The hardest part wasn't losing Sarah. The hardest part was realizing how long I had confused being used with being loved. I had convinced myself that always saying yes made me a good friend, when really it had made me a convenient one. Real friends don't only remember you exist when they need something. Real friends check in because they care, not because they want something. Real friends offer support both ways, not just take it from one direction. I learned to value my friendship differently after that. I learned that saying no doesn't make you a bad friend, it makes you a friend with boundaries. I learned that people who truly care about you will still be there when you're not being useful. And I learned that the friend who disappears when you stop giving is not a friend worth keeping. These days, my friendships are smaller but stronger, built on mutual care instead of one-sided convenience. And honestly, I sleep better knowing that the people in my life actually want to be there, not just when they need something from me. Sometimes the most expensive lesson you can learn is the true cost of being too generous with people who mistake your kindness for weakness. Man, that one stings because so many of us have been Kelly at some point. There's something heartbreaking about realizing you've been confusing transaction with connection, convenience with care. It's tough to learn that not everyone who takes your help actually values your heart. But honestly, good for her for finally seeing the pattern and choosing friends who show up for more than just favours. Our next story takes us in a completely different direction, to a classroom where someone discovered something important about themselves. The class I barely passed. I've never been good at math. Numbers and I have had a contentious relationship since elementary school, when I first realised that some people's brains just work differently when it comes to equations and formulas. While my classmates sailed through multiplication tables, I was still counting on my fingers under my desk, hoping nobody would notice. By high school, I had mastered the art of scraping by in math classes. I'd sit in the back, keep my head down, pray I wouldn't get called on, and somehow manage to pull C-minuses that kept me moving forward. My guidance counsellor suggested I take basic math my senior year, something easy to round out my schedule. But there was a problem. The easy math class was full, and the only option left was advanced statistics with Mr. Rodriguez. I tried everything to get out of it. I begged the counsellor to put me on a waiting list. I offered to take summer school instead. I even considered dropping math altogether and hoping college wouldn't notice. Nothing worked. First day of senior year, there I was, walking into a classroom full of kids who actually enjoyed numbers, carrying a brand new graphing calculator I had no idea how to use. Mr. Rodriguez was one of those teachers who genuinely believed every student could succeed if they worked hard enough, which was inspiring for kids who had a foundation to build on, and absolutely terrifying for someone like me who felt like they were showing up to a construction site with a plastic spoon. The first quiz was a disaster. I got a 23%. The second quiz was worse. Somehow I managed an 18%. By October, I was sitting in Mr. Rodriguez's classroom after school, staring at a progress report that showed I was failing spectacularly. "Marcus," he said, sitting down across from me, "what's going on? I can see you trying, but something isn't clicking." I wanted to tell him that my brain just didn't work that way, that some people are math people and some aren't, and I had accepted my place in the universe as someone who would never understand statistics. Instead, I just shrugged and said I was doing my best. "Your best right now isn't good enough," he said, and I thought he was about to suggest I drop the class. "So we need to figure out how to make your best better." For the next 6 months, Mr. Rodriguez became my personal statistics tutor. Every day after school, we'd sit in that classroom and he'd walk me through problems step by step. Not just showing me how to get the right answer, but helping me understand why the answer made sense. It was brutal. There were afternoons when I wanted to quit, when the frustration felt bigger than any possible reward. I'd spend 2 hours on homework that should have taken 30 minutes. I'd study for tests longer than I'd ever studied for anything, only to still struggle with concepts that seemed automatic to everyone else. But something weird started happening around February. The problems that had looked like ancient hieroglyphics in September were starting to look like puzzles I could actually solve. I wasn't getting everything right, but I was getting enough right to feel like maybe I wasn't completely hopeless. My first B+ on a quiz felt like winning the lottery. I literally ran to Mr. Rodriguez's desk to show him, and he smiled like he'd known it was coming all along. "See?" he said. "You're a math person. You just needed to learn how to speak the language." I ended that class with a C+, barely passing by most standards, but it felt like climbing Mount Everest. More importantly, I learned something about myself that I carried into everything else I did afterward. I learned that I could do hard things, not easily, not naturally, but persistently. I learned that struggling with something doesn't mean you're not capable of it. It just means you have to work differently to get there. When I got to college and hit my first really challenging courses, I didn't panic the way I might have before. When I started my first job and felt overwhelmed by the learning curve, I remembered those afternoons in Mr. Rodriguez's classroom. When I decided to go back to school for my master's degree and had to take research methods, I signed up for tutoring on day one. That statistics class taught me that there's a difference between being naturally good at something and being willing to work hard enough to become good at it. Most of the skills that matter in life fall into the second category. I'm not a math person, probably never will be, but I'm a person who can learn math when I need to. I'm a person who can sit with discomfort and confusion long enough for understanding to eventually show up. I'm a person who can do hard things slowly and imperfectly, but consistently enough to get where I need to go. Mr. Rodriguez taught me statistics, but more importantly, he taught me that persistence is its own kind of intelligence. That showing up every day, even when you're struggling, especially when you're struggling, is how you build the muscle that carries you through everything else life throws at you. I still have that final exam from his class. C+ written in red ink at the top. It's framed on my wall next to my college diploma and my first job offer, because sometimes the grades you barely earn teach you more than the ones that come easily. That barely passing grade represents the semester I learned I was stronger than I thought I was. There's something so beautiful about discovering you're more resilient than you ever imagined. Marcus learned one of life's most valuable lessons in that classroom, that persistence can be more powerful than natural talent. Sometimes the subjects that break us are the ones that rebuild us stronger. It's wild how a C+ can feel like the biggest victory when you know what it took to get there. Let's shift gears now to a story about an unexpected encounter on a dark street. The stranger who gave me directions. I moved to Chicago for my first real job out of college, and honestly, I was terrified. New city, no friends, tiny apartment in a neighborhood I'd never heard of. But I was determined to figure it out, to prove to myself and everyone back home that I could make it on my own. 3 weeks into living there, I had to work late on a project that was due the next morning. By the time I finally left the office, it was almost 11 at night. I'd been taking the train to and from work every day, but I'd never had to navigate the system this late. And apparently, my sense of direction completely abandons me after 10 p.m. I got off at what I thought was my stop, climbed up from the underground station, and immediately knew I was in the wrong place. Nothing looked familiar. The streets were darker than my neighborhood, and there were way fewer people around. I pulled out my phone to check the map, but of course my battery was at 3%. I started walking in what I hoped was the right direction, but after 15 minutes, I was even more lost. The street signs weren't helping, and I was starting to panic. I'd heard all the warnings about wandering around alone late at night in a big city, and here I was, doing exactly that. I was standing on a corner trying to decide which way to go when this older guy approached me. He was probably in his 60s, wearing a worn leather jacket and carrying a thermos that smelled like coffee. My first instinct was to be wary, but he stopped a few feet away and asked if I was okay. "I think I'm lost," I admitted, feeling embarrassed. "I was trying to get to the Belmont station, but I think I got off too early." He nodded and looked around, getting his bearings. "You're about 8 blocks away," he said. "That's a bit of a walk, especially this late. You waiting for someone to pick you up?" I explained that I was new to the city, that I didn't really know anyone yet, and that my phone was about to die. He listened, then made a decision that probably saved my entire night. "I'm heading that way anyway," he said. "Mind if I walk with you? These streets can be tricky if you don't know them." Part of me was still cautious, but something about his demeanour felt genuinely helpful rather than threatening. He had this calm, fatherly presence that reminded me of my neighbour back home, who used to help everyone on our street with car trouble. We started walking, and he began pointing out landmarks. "See that blue building? That's how you know you're getting close to your neighborhood. And this street here, it's got the best Thai food in the city, but they close early, so you'll have to try it for lunch sometime. As we walked, he told me he'd lived in Chicago for 30 years, had raised 3 kids here, and that he understood how overwhelming the city could feel when you're new. He asked about my job, what brought me to Chicago, how I was adjusting to living alone for the first time. It gets easier, he said, as we turned onto a street I finally recognized. The city feels huge when you first get here, but after a while it starts feeling like a collection of small neighborhoods. You'll find your rhythm. Duat. When we reached the Belmont station, he waited with me until the train arrived, even though he said he was heading in a different direction. As I was getting on, he handed me a small piece of paper with his name and phone number written on it. Just in case you get lost again, he said, or if you need someone to call who knows the city. No pressure, but the offer's there. I thanked him probably 10 times, and he just smiled and said, "We've all been new somewhere. Pass it forward when you can." I never did call that number, but I kept that piece of paper in my wallet for 2 years until it was too worn to read. More importantly, I never forgot what he taught me that night. Not just about getting around the city, but about the kind of person I wanted to be. 6 months later, I saw a girl about my age standing outside a restaurant, clearly lost and checking her phone with that same panicked expression I'd had that night. I walked over and asked if she needed help finding anything. Turns out she was looking for a bookstore that was just 3 blocks away. I offered to walk her there, and on the way we talked about how intimidating the city could feel when you were still figuring it out. When we got to the bookstore, she thanked me, and I heard myself saying the exact same words that stranger had said to me. "We've all been new somewhere. Pass it forward when you can." That one act of kindness from a complete stranger didn't just help me get home that night. It taught me what it means to look out for each other, especially when someone is vulnerable or lost. It showed me that helping someone doesn't have to be a big dramatic gesture. Sometimes it's just walking with them until they're somewhere safe. I still live in Chicago, and I know those streets like the back of my hand now, but I never pass someone who looks lost without stopping to ask if they need directions. Because I remember what it felt like to be scared and alone on a dark street, and I remember how much it meant when someone chose to help instead of just walking by. That stranger taught me that kindness is a choice we make every day, often for people we'll never see again, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone is simply walk beside them until they find their way. That story gives me chills because it's such a perfect example of how one person's kindness can completely shift your perspective. That stranger didn't just give directions, he gave a masterclass in being human. The fact that it turned into a chain of kindness years later shows how these small moments ripple out in ways we never expect. Sometimes guardian angels wear leather jackets and carry coffee thermoses. The summer I worked 2 jobs. The summer before my senior year of college, I made what felt like the worst decision of my life. While my friends were planning beach trips and music festivals, I committed to working 2 jobs to save money for my final year of school. Monday through Friday at a law firm doing filing and data entry. Weekends at a busy brunch restaurant, waiting tables. I thought I was being responsible and mature. Turns out I was setting myself up for the most exhausting and educational 3 months of my entire life. My weekdays started at 7 a.m. when I'd catch the bus downtown to the law firm. The work was mind-numbingly boring. 8 hours of organising case files, entering client information into databases, and making copies of documents I wasn't allowed to read. The office was freezing cold, my supervisor barely acknowledged my existence, and I spent most days watching the clock and calculating how many more hours until I could leave. But then Friday evening would hit, and I'd have exactly 12 hours to recover before my weekend shift started. The restaurant job was the complete opposite of the law firm. Constant motion, demanding customers, orders flying out of the kitchen, and tips that varied wildly depending on factors completely outside my control. Some shifts I'd make $60 in tips, other shifts I'd barely break 20. I learned to smile through complaints about food I didn't cook, apologize for delays I couldn't control, and hustle harder than I ever had in my life. The first month was brutal. I was exhausted constantly, had no social life, and started questioning whether saving money was worth sacrificing my entire summer. My friends would text me about parties and day trips, and I'd look at my schedule and realize I literally didn't have a single free day until August. I remember one particularly awful weekend when the restaurant was slammed. We were understaffed, and I made 3 separate mistakes that resulted in angry customers and a lecture from my manager. I went home that night, looked at my bank account, and saw that I'd made $87 for 10 hours of work. I sat on my bed and cried, convinced I was an idiot for putting myself through this. But something shifted in the second month. I started getting better at managing my time and energy. I learned to pack efficient lunches that would keep me going through long days. I figured out which coffee shop near the law firm had the cheapest caffeine. I developed strategies for handling difficult restaurant customers that actually made my shifts more enjoyable. More importantly, I started seeing my paychecks differently. Every dollar represented hours of my life, which made me incredibly conscious of how I spent money. That $5 coffee I used to buy without thinking suddenly felt like half an hour of filing documents. That impulse purchase at Target represented 2 hours of dealing with Sunday brunch crowds. By the end of July, I had developed a level of discipline I didn't know I was capable of. I could work 8 hours, commute home, grab a quick dinner, and still have energy to do laundry or call my parents. I could handle multiple restaurant tables during rush hour without breaking down. I could manage my money in ways that made every dollar count. The numbers at the end of the summer were incredible. I'd saved almost $4,000, which was more money than I'd ever had in my life. But the real education wasn't financial, it was personal. I learned that I could do things I didn't want to do, consistently and without complaining, when I had a clear reason why. I learned that being tired doesn't mean you can't function. It just means you have to be smarter about how you use your energy. I learned that every job, even the boring ones, teaches you something about work ethic and professionalism. Most importantly, I learned the difference between working hard and working smart. The law firm job taught me about consistency and attention to detail. The restaurant job taught me about efficiency and customer service. Together, they taught me about time management and financial discipline that I still use every day. When I went back to school that fall, I felt different, more confident, more focused, more appreciative of things I'd previously taken for granted. I didn't stress about money the way I had in previous years. I managed my time better because I'd learned to value it properly. I approached my classes with a work ethic that had been forged in those long summer days. My friends had great summer stories about concerts and road trips. I had calluses on my hands and a bank account that meant I could graduate without additional student loans. Looking back, I wouldn't trade that miserable, exhausting educational summer for anything. It taught me that I could handle more than I thought I could, save more than I thought I could, and work harder than I thought I could when the goal was worth it. That summer I learned that sometimes the best investment you can make isn't in fun experiences or material things. Sometimes it's in discovering what you're actually capable of when you commit to something completely. The discipline I built that summer carried me through my final year of college, my first job search, and every challenging work situation I've faced since. Because once you know you can work 2 jobs while maintaining your sanity and your standards, pretty much everything else feels manageable. Sarah learned one of the most valuable lessons anyone can learn, that hard work in the present creates freedom in the future. There's something powerful about discovering you can endure more than you thought possible when you have a clear goal. That summer shaped her work ethic in ways that probably paid dividends for years afterward. Sometimes, the experiences that feel like punishment at the time turn out to be the ones that build the strongest foundation. The argument with my sister. My sister Emma and I had what I can only describe as the fight of our lives when I was 25 and she was 28. It started over something completely stupid, and escalated into 6 months of not speaking to each other, which was the longest we'd ever gone without talking since we were kids. The fight began at our cousin's wedding reception. Emma had been dating this guy, Derek, for about 2 years, and honestly, none of us liked him. He was condescending to waitstaff, made inappropriate comments about other women, and had this habit of putting Emma down in front of people that made everyone uncomfortable. At the reception, Derek had too much to drink and started making jokes about Emma's career. She's a social worker, and he kept making comments about how she was wasting her education on a job that didn't pay enough to matter. He said it was cute that she wanted to save the world, but maybe it was time to get serious about her future. I watched Emma's face throughout this, and I could see her shrinking with every comment. The Emma I knew was confident and passionate about her work, but around Derek she became this smaller version of herself. It was painful to watch. After Derek excused himself to get another drink, I couldn't keep quiet anymore. I pulled Emma aside and told her that she deserved better than someone who talked about her like that. I said Derek was disrespectful and that she seemed miserable whenever he was around. Emma's response was immediate and furious. She accused me of being jealous that she was in a relationship while I was single. She said I had no right to judge her boyfriend when I couldn't even maintain a relationship myself. She told me I was being a terrible sister by trying to sabotage her happiness. The conversation spiraled from there. I said things about Derek that I'd been holding back for months. Emma said things about my dating life and my tendency to be critical of everyone she brought around. We both said things we didn't mean and meant things we probably shouldn't have said. The fight ended with Emma storming off and me standing alone outside the reception hall, shaking with anger and hurt. We didn't speak for the rest of the wedding weekend. What followed was the most stubborn standoff of our lives. We'd both inherited the same prideful streak from our father, which meant neither of us was going to apologise first. Family gatherings became awkward minefields where we'd interact politely but coldly. Our parents tried to mediate, but we were both convinced we were right, and the other person needed to make the first move. Meanwhile, Emma continued dating Derek, and I continued thinking she was making a huge mistake. Every family update about them made me angry, and I'm sure every time she heard I was still single confirmed her belief that I was jealous and bitter. The silence stretched from weeks into months. I missed her birthday. She missed mine. We spent Thanksgiving at the same table, barely speaking to each other. It was miserable for everyone, but especially for us. The breaking point came in February when Emma called me at 2 a.m, crying. Derek had broken up with her, but not before confirming everything I'd said about him at the wedding. He'd told her she was too emotional, too invested in her dead-end career, and that he needed someone more ambitious and less dramatic. Emma was devastated, not just because of the breakup, but because she realised she'd defended someone who had been tearing her down for months. She'd lost 6 months of her relationship with her sister, protecting someone who didn't even respect her. "I'm sorry," she said through tears. "You were right about him, and I was wrong to attack you for caring about me." I cried too, because I realised that being right about Derek didn't feel like winning when it meant watching my sister get hurt. I apologised for the way I'd handled the situation, for not being more supportive, for letting pride keep us apart for so long. We talked until 4 a.m, catching up on 6 months of life we'd missed. Emma told me about how isolated she'd felt in her relationship, how Derek had slowly convinced her that her family was too involved in her business. I told her about the job I'd started, the guy I'd been seeing, the things I'd wanted to share with her but couldn't because we weren't speaking. That fight and the reconciliation that followed changed our relationship fundamentally. We learned that we could survive major conflict and come back stronger. We learned to disagree without attacking each other personally. We learned that protecting each other sometimes means having difficult conversations. More importantly, we learned that our relationship was more important than being right, more valuable than our pride, and strong enough to weather the kind of fight that might have permanently damaged other relationships. Emma is married now to someone who thinks her career is amazing and supports her in every way Derek never did. I was her maid of honour, and in my speech I talked about how grateful I was that we'd learned to fight and make up because it meant we could handle anything life threw at us. That 6-month silence taught us both that conflict doesn't have to be destructive. Sometimes it's just the prelude to a deeper understanding. Sometimes you have to break something before you can rebuild it stronger than it was before. We still disagree about things, but we disagree better now. We know how to be honest without being cruel, how to care without being controlling, and how to apologise without sacrificing our dignity. That terrible fight was also the beginning of the closest relationship we've ever had. Because now we know we can survive each other's worst moments and still choose to love each other through them. Conflict taught us something that years of getting along never could. That real love isn't about never fighting. It's about fighting fair and always finding your way back to each other. This story hits so hard because it shows how sometimes the people we love most are the ones we hurt deepest. Emma and her sister learned that being right isn't always worth being distant, and that real relationships can survive brutal honesty when it comes from a place of love. 6 months of silence taught them more about their bond than years of surface-level peace ever could. Sometimes you have to break something completely before you can rebuild it properly. The time I was rejected. I still remember the exact moment I opened that email. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March, and I'd been checking my inbox obsessively for 3 weeks, waiting to hear back from Northwestern University about my graduate school application. I had planned my entire future around getting into their journalism program. It was the perfect school, the perfect location, the perfect stepping stone to the career I'd dreamed about since high school. The subject line was simple: Northwestern Graduate School Application Update. My heart was pounding as I clicked it open, and the first word I saw was unfortunately. I didn't even finish reading the email. I slammed my laptop shut and just sat there in my dorm room, staring at the wall. All those months of preparation, the application fees, the personal statements I'd rewritten 15 times, the professors I'd begged for recommendation letters, all of it for nothing. My backup school was State University, about 3 hours from home. I'd applied there because my advisor said I needed safety options, but I'd never seriously considered going there. It felt like settling, like admitting defeat before my career even started. Northwestern was where real journalists went. State was where people who couldn't get into Northwestern went. I wallowed for about a week. I complained to anyone who would listen about how unfair the admissions process was, how I was just as qualified as anyone else, how one rejection letter was going to derail my entire future. My friends were supportive, but clearly getting tired of my dramatic declarations about my ruined life. Finally, my dad called and told me to get over myself. "You got into a good school," he said. "Stop acting like it's the end of the world and start figuring out how to make the most of where you're going." He was right, but I was still bitter when I arrived at State that fall. I walked around campus comparing everything to what I imagined Northwestern would have been like. The buildings weren't as impressive. The other students didn't seem as ambitious. The whole place felt like consolation prize. My attitude started to shift during my first week of classes. My news writing professor, Dr. Martinez, had worked as an investigative reporter for 25 years before coming to teach at State. On the first day, she told us that she'd turned down offers from more prestigious programs because she believed State students were hungrier, more willing to work hard because they had something to prove. "Nobody handed you this opportunity," she said, looking around the room. "You're here because you earned it, and that means you'll value it more than students who had everything given to them." That semester, Dr. Martinez became my mentor in ways I never expected. She pushed us harder than any professor I'd had, but she also spent hours after class helping us improve our writing, our interviewing skills, our understanding of media ethics. She treated us like we were already professional journalists, not just students playing pretend. By October, I was working at the campus newspaper and loving it. The staff was small. which meant I got to cover stories that would have gone to senior writers at bigger schools. I interviewed the mayor about budget cuts, covered a corruption scandal in the athletics department, wrote feature stories about students who were doing incredible things but flying under the radar. The real turning point came during my second semester when Dr. Martinez told me about an internship opportunity at a regional newspaper. It wasn't glamorous, a small daily in a town I'd never heard of, but she said the editor was someone who really developed young talent. I almost didn't apply because it wasn't what I'd pictured for myself. But Dr. Martinez sat me down and said something I'll never forget. Stop waiting for your life to look like what you thought it would look like, and start paying attention to what it actually looks like. You might be surprised. That summer internship changed everything. The editor, Tom, had started his career at small papers and worked his way up to major publications. He taught me more about real journalism in 3 months than I'd learned in all my previous classes combined. I covered city council meetings, investigated local environmental issues, wrote profiles of community leaders who were making real differences in people's lives. More importantly, I learned that good journalism wasn't about prestigious bylines or famous newspapers. It was about telling stories that mattered to the people reading them. Some of my best work that summer was about things that would never make national news but were incredibly important to the community I was covering. When I went back to school for my senior year, I had a completely different perspective. I threw myself into my coursework, took on leadership roles at the campus paper, and started building relationships with working journalists who could teach me about the industry. By graduation, I had a job offer from a mid-sized daily newspaper in a city I actually wanted to live in. The editor who hired me said my clips showed the kind of practical experience and community focus that they valued more than a prestigious degree. I've been working as a journalist for 5 years now, and I love what I do. I cover stories that matter, work with colleagues who are passionate about their craft, and feel like I'm making a real contribution to my community. I've won several regional journalism awards and been offered positions at larger papers, but I'm happy where I am. Last year I ran into a former classmate who'd gone to Northwestern. She was complaining about how competitive and cutthroat the program had been, how the professors were more focused on their own research than on teaching, how she'd graduated feeling burned out and cynical about journalism. I realised then that getting rejected from Northwestern was probably the best thing that could have happened to me. At State, I learned to work harder because I had to prove myself. I got more hands-on experience because the classes were smaller. I developed relationships with professors who saw teaching as their primary mission, not a distraction from more important work. Most importantly, I learned that the path you take matters less than what you do with it. Northwestern might have opened certain doors more easily, but State taught me to build my own doors when the obvious ones were closed. That rejection letter that felt like the end of the world was actually the beginning of exactly the career I was meant to have. Sometimes what feels like failure is just life steering you towards something better than what you originally planned. That story hits different because we've all had those moments where rejection feels like the universe telling us we're not good enough. But Laura discovered something so important that sometimes the door that doesn't open is protecting you from the wrong room. The path that felt like settling turned out to be exactly where she needed to be to become who she was meant to become. It's beautiful how what feels like plan B can actually be plan A in disguise. The neighbour who always waved. There was this older guy who lived across the street from me for about 3 years, and I never learned his name. I knew he drove a blue Honda, kept his lawn immaculately trimmed, and waved at me every single morning when I left for work. It started accidentally. I was walking to my car one morning, probably looking half dead because I'm not a morning person, when I noticed him getting his newspaper from the driveway. He looked up, saw me and gave this cheerful wave like we were old friends. I waved back because it would have been rude not to, and that was that. But then it kept happening. Every morning, there he was. Sometimes getting his paper, sometimes watering his flowers, sometimes just standing on his porch with a cup of coffee. And every morning, he'd see me and wave with this genuine enthusiasm that was honestly too much energy for 7:30 a.m. I started timing my departure around his routine without really thinking about it. If I was running late, I'd glance toward his house to see if he was outside. If I left early, I'd slow down a bit in case he appeared. It became this weird little ritual that bookended my morning commute. The wave evolved over time. At first, it was just a basic hand raise, but gradually it became more elaborate. He'd do this full arm sweep, like he was greeting royalty. Sometimes, he'd tip an imaginary hat. Once, memorably, he did jazz hands, which made me actually laugh out loud on my way to the car. I started waving back with equal enthusiasm. If he was going to commit to this morning greeting ritual, I was going to match his energy. We developed this unspoken competition of who could be more dramatic with their wave. My neighbours probably thought I was losing my mind, gesticulating wildly at a house across the street every morning. The thing is, I never actually spoke to him. We were just two people who had somehow agreed to acknowledge each other's existence with increasingly theatrical hand gestures. I didn't know if he had family, what he did for work, or even his name. But that daily wave became this consistent, bright spot in my morning routine. It sounds silly, but there was something comforting about knowing that no matter how stressful my day was going to be, no matter how much I was dreading work or meetings, or whatever crisis was waiting for me, there would be this moment of connection with someone who seemed genuinely happy to see me. On days when he wasn't outside, I'd feel slightly off balance, like I'd forgotten something important or skipped a step in my routine. I'd find myself looking for him when I got home from work, wondering if everything was okay. This went on for 3 years. 3 years of daily waves, seasonal variations in his gardening activities, and this strange long-distance friendship that existed entirely in gestures. Then one Monday morning, there was a moving truck in his driveway. I stood by my car watching strangers load furniture and boxes, feeling oddly emotional about losing someone I'd never technically met. I waited around longer than I should have, hoping he'd come outside so I could give him one final wave, maybe even walk over and actually introduce myself. But he never appeared. By the time I got home from work, the truck was gone and the house was empty. I kept looking for him for weeks afterward. Every morning, I'd glance toward his house out of habit, and every morning, I'd remember that he wasn't there anymore. It was such a small thing, but the absence of that daily wave left this weird gap in my morning routine. I realised how much that simple interaction had meant to me. For 3 years, this stranger had made a point of acknowledging me, of starting my day with a moment of human connection. He didn't know anything about my life, but he'd made it slightly better just by being consistently kind. I started paying more attention to my other neighbours after that. I learned the names of the family next door, started chatting with the woman who walks her dog past my house every evening, made an effort to actually engage with the people I shared a street with, but I still miss my waving neighbour. Sometimes when I'm having a particularly rough morning, I think about his jazz hands wave and smile. He taught me that you don't need to know someone's life story to make their day a little brighter. Sometimes the smallest gestures create the biggest impact. I hope wherever he moved, he found new neighbours to wave at, and I hope they wave back with the same enthusiasm I should have shown from day one. That daily wave was such a small thing, but it turns out small things can leave surprisingly big holes when they're gone. There's something so pure about that story, because it shows how tiny acts of kindness can become the thread that holds someone's day together. 3 years of waves created a connection that didn't need words to be meaningful. The fact that this stranger chose to bring that much joy to someone's morning, every single morning, just because he could, that's the kind of humanity that restores your faith in people. The professor who believed in me. I was 3 weeks away from dropping out of college when Professor Williams called me into her office. I was failing 2 classes, barely scraping by in the others, and honestly convinced that I wasn't smart enough for higher education. My parents had sacrificed a lot to send me to school, but I felt like I was just wasting their money and my time. The meeting wasn't about any specific assignment or grade. She just asked me to come in during her office hours to chat about how things were going. I assumed it was going to be one of those gentle conversations where a professor tries to let you down easy before suggesting you consider other options. Professor Williams taught my Introduction to Psychology class, which was supposed to be an easy general education requirement. Except it wasn't easy for me. I struggled with the reading, felt lost during lectures, and my test scores were consistently disappointing. I'd stopped participating in class discussions because I was convinced I'd say something stupid and confirm everyone's suspicions that I didn't belong there. When I walked into her office that Tuesday afternoon, she had my midterm exam on her desk. I'd gotten a D-, which was actually an improvement from my previous tests, but still nothing to be proud of. "How do you think you did on this exam?" she asked, which seemed like an odd question, since we could both see the grade written in red ink. I told her I thought I'd failed completely and was surprised I'd even managed a D-. She nodded and then asked me to walk her through my thought process on one of the essay questions. As I explained my answer, she started taking notes and asking follow-up questions. Not about the content of my response, but about how I'd approached the problem. She wanted to know how I'd organised my thoughts, what connections I'd made between different concepts, what examples I'd drawn from. 20 minutes later, she leaned back in her chair and said something that completely blindsided me. "You have one of the most interesting minds I've encountered in 15 years of teaching." I stared at her, certain she was confusing me with another student. I pointed to the D- on the exam and asked how someone with an interesting mind could perform so poorly. "Because you're trying to fit your thinking into structures that don't work for how your brain processes information," she said. "You're not failing because you're not smart. You're failing because you're trying to be smart in ways that don't match your natural strengths." She spent the next hour explaining learning styles, different types of intelligence, and the ways that traditional academic formats can actually hinder certain kinds of thinkers. She told me that my exam answers showed creative problem solving and innovative connections, even when they didn't hit the specific points she was looking for. "The education system rewards one type of thinking," she said, "but the world needs all types of thinking. Your job isn't to become a different kind of thinker. Your job is to learn how to succeed as the kind of thinker you already are." Over the next few weeks, Professor Williams worked with me to develop study strategies that matched how my brain actually worked. Instead of trying to memorize information linearly, she taught me to create concept maps and visual connections. Instead of writing traditional essays, she showed me how to structure my thoughts in ways that felt natural but still met academic requirements. More importantly, she started pointing out moments in class when my questions or comments demonstrated exactly the kind of thinking she was talking about. She'd say things like, "That's a perfect example of synthetic thinking," or "You just made a connection that I hadn't considered." Slowly, I started to see my academic struggles differently. Instead of evidence that I wasn't smart enough for college, they became evidence that I was trying to succeed using tools that weren't designed for how I learned. My grades didn't magically transform overnight, but they steadily improved as I learned to work with my brain instead of against it. More importantly, I stopped feeling like an imposter who had somehow tricked his way into college. Professor Williams encouraged me to take more psychology classes, and I discovered that I had a real aptitude for understanding human behavior and social dynamics. She helped me find research opportunities and connected me with other faculty members who appreciated different types of thinking. By senior year, I was thriving academically and had decided to pursue graduate school in counselling psychology. Professor Williams wrote one of my recommendation letters, and years later, I learned that she'd described me as one of the most naturally gifted students she'd ever worked with. I'm a licensed therapist now, and I love my work. I'm good at it precisely because of the way my mind works, the same way of thinking that nearly convinced me to drop out of college. I can see patterns in human behavior that others miss, make connections between seemingly unrelated issues, and approach problems from angles that traditional training doesn't always teach. Every week, I work with clients who are struggling with feeling like they don't fit into conventional structures. People who think they're failing when they're actually just trying to succeed in systems that weren't designed for their strengths. I always think about Professor Williams when I help someone reframe their challenges as differences rather than deficits. She saved my academic career, but more than that, she taught me to value the way my mind works instead of apologizing for it. She showed me that intelligence comes in many forms, and that the world needs people who think differently, not people who all think the same way. I still have that D- exam in a folder somewhere, along with the A I eventually earned in her advanced psychology course. They remind me that sometimes the difference between failure and success isn't changing who you are, but finding someone who sees who you are clearly enough to help you become it. That story is everything, because it shows how one person's belief can completely redirect another person's life trajectory. Professor Williams didn't just see a struggling student, she saw potential that was being stifled by the wrong approach. The fact that she took the time to understand how his mind actually worked instead of just writing him off as a poor performer. That's the kind of teaching that changes lives. Sometimes we don't need to be fixed, we just need to be understood. The day I missed the train. I was running late for the most important job interview of my life, sprinting through Penn Station with my portfolio bouncing against my hip and sweat soaking through my shirt despite the October chill. The 8:47 to Boston was supposed to get me there, with just enough time to grab coffee and compose myself before meeting with the design firm I'd been dreaming about working for since college. I rounded the corner to my platform and watched the train doors slide shut. I pounded on the window like that would somehow make the conductor change his mind, but all I got was a sympathetic shrug from a passenger who'd made it aboard. The train pulled away, taking my interview and possibly my entire career trajectory with it. I stood on the platform, feeling like a complete failure. This interview had taken months to arrange. I'd redesigned my portfolio 3 times, researched every project the firm had worked on in the past 5 years, and practiced my presentation until I could deliver it in my sleep. And I'd blown it all by oversleeping and missing a train. The next train to Boston wasn't for 2 hours, which meant I'd be arriving 40 minutes late to an interview that was supposed to last 30 minutes. I called the firm to explain and reschedule, and the receptionist was polite, but clear that the partners were flying to Los Angeles that afternoon and wouldn't be available again for several weeks. I slumped onto a bench and seriously considered just going home to sulk. But I'd already bought the ticket, and sitting in my apartment beating myself up wasn't going to improve the situation, so I decided to take the later train anyway, maybe explore Boston for a few hours, and pretend it was a planned day trip rather than a professional disaster. When I finally boarded the 10:47, I was still feeling sorry for myself. I found a seat next to a guy about my age who was sketching in a notebook and listening to music. Normally, I would have just put in my own headphones and stared out the window, but something about his drawings caught my attention. "Is that architecture?" I asked, nodding toward his notebook. He looked up and smiled. "Sort of. Industrial design. I'm working on concepts for a new type of public seating. You know how uncomfortable train seats are. I'm trying to figure out how to make them better without completely redesigning the cars." We started talking about design, and it turned out we had similar backgrounds and interests. His name was Marcus, and he was heading to Boston to visit a friend, but also to check out some design firms he was considering applying to. He'd graduated from art school the year before and was freelancing while trying to figure out his next career move. I told him about my missed interview disaster, and instead of offering generic sympathy, he asked to see my portfolio. For the next hour, we spread my work across the train table, and he gave me feedback that was more insightful than anything I'd gotten from career counsellors or professors. "Your technical skills are solid," he said, "but these pieces don't tell me anything about you as a person. What problems do you actually want to solve?" What kind of design work makes you excited to get up in the morning? It was a question I'd never really considered. I'd been so focused on creating a portfolio that would impress potential employers that I'd forgotten to include work that actually represented my interests and values. Marcus showed me some of his projects, and they were incredible. Not just technically proficient, but thoughtful and human-centered in ways that made me rethink what good design could accomplish. He was working on accessibility solutions, sustainable materials, products that could improve people's daily lives in small but meaningful ways. By the time we reached Boston, we'd exchanged contact information and made plans to meet up back in New York. But more than that, I had a completely different perspective on what I wanted my career to look like. Instead of spending the day moping around Boston, I used the time to visit design studios and galleries that Marcus had recommended. I saw work that inspired me, talked to designers who were solving problems I cared about, and started to get excited about possibilities I hadn't considered before. On the train ride home, I redesigned my entire portfolio approach. Instead of trying to showcase everything I could do, I focused on the work that represented the kind of designer I actually wanted to be. I included personal projects I'd been embarrassed to show professionally, experiments with sustainable materials, designs that prioritized accessibility over aesthetics. 6 months later, I got hired by a small design firm that specialized in exactly the kind of socially conscious work that Marcus had helped me realize I was passionate about. The job paid less than the Boston firm would have, but it was infinitely more fulfilling. Marcus and I became close friends and eventually started a design collaborative together. We've been working on accessibility solutions and sustainable design projects for 3 years now, and I love what we've built. Last month, I ran into someone who worked at the Boston firm I'd missed the interview with. She told me the company had struggled with layoffs and leadership changes, and that several junior designers had left because the work was uninspiring and the culture was toxic. I realized that missing that train hadn't derailed my career at all. It had saved me from taking a job that would have made me miserable and connected me with someone who became both a collaborator and one of my closest friends. Sometimes what feels like the worst possible timing is actually perfect timing in disguise. Sometimes missing the train you thought you needed to catch gets you onto the one that actually takes you where you're supposed to go. That missed interview taught me that the most important opportunities aren't always the ones we plan for. Sometimes they're sitting right next to us, sketching in a notebook, while we're too busy feeling sorry for ourselves to notice. What an incredible reminder that life's biggest disappointments can become its greatest redirections. Missing that train felt like failure, but it led to exactly the career and friendship he was meant to have. Sometimes the universe has better timing than we do, even when it feels like everything's falling apart. The fact that his perfect collaborator was literally sitting in the next seat shows how the right connections find us when we're open to them. If you enjoyed this batch of life lesson stories, consider leaving a like and subscribing for more Reddit stories just like these. If we hit 9,000 subscribers right as soon as this video went live, I just want to thank you again for your support. Other than that, thank you for watching, and I will see you tomorrow. Take care.